Have you given any presentations to judicial symposiums on domestic violence?
Yes, I've also been, contacted by, sometimes judges will have symposiums in their courtroom. They will make a decision to hold a particular symposium on particular topics, and I was, asked to come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. To come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions. Some do the presentation. Some do the presentation. The research tell us about how do we understand that, and how can we really accurately assess that? And that was sort of the bulk of what that training was about.
What professional organizations do you belong to?
I belong to a number. I belong to the American Psychological Association, which is the largest body of psychologists in the United States, over here, headquarters in DC. Because it's so big, there are subdivisions of American Psychological Association. So I belong to the Division of Trauma Psychology. I belong to the Division of Psychology and the Law, the Division of Psychologists in Private Practice. I belong to other organizations, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, which, as the name says, it's an international society where we are interdisciplinary, mostly psychiatry and psychology, researchers and clinicians, to really understand and further our awareness about trauma and traumatic stress. I belong to the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation. I belong to the Anxiety Disorders of Association of America. I'm a fellow in the American Board of Forensic Psychology. I don't know if I'm forgetting any.
Okay. Are any of these specific to interpersonal violence or trauma?
Well, clearly the trauma division of the American Psychological Association, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation, and then also the Anxiety Disorders Association continues to talk about trauma, because prior to this new DSM-5, it was PTSD was originally categorized under the anxiety disorders. So there are still colleagues and researchers in the anxiety disorders organizations who talk about PTSD and trauma.
Do you hold any leadership roles in these organizations?
Yes, I am currently the president-elect of the trauma division of the American Psychological Association. That is an elected position. You have to be elected by our membership. And now I serve as with the presidential trio. So there's three of us who serve with the immediate past president, the current president, and the president-elect. So it's a 3-year term. And what we try to do is continue to disseminate best practices in trauma psychology and also interface with the larger American Psychological Association organization to continue to disseminate best practices and have just a voice for trauma psychology with our larger body and policy making. I've been involved in the Trauma Psychology Executive Board since its inception.
Experts do so much shit, it's ridiculous. The Muffin Lady!
Program chair and awards chair. I was the APA counselor.
Muffin time. Somebody call me.
To serve a 3-year term and sit on the governance board at APA, representing the division of trauma psychology. So I've been very actively involved in the trauma division.
And what is the Division of Trauma Psychology?
So the Division of Trauma Psychology are psychologists who come together who want to disseminate best practices in trauma psychology. We want to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of research and evidence-based interventions for people who are struggling with traumatic events that have happened to them.
Having trouble hearing you with your mic,
Served in
Uncle. I
leadership
don't know.
positions of other professional organizations.
Yes, I was, there's a New York City-based organization called the Women's Mental Health Interdisciplinary organization, psychology, psychiatry, nursing, social work, and this was formed in order to give women sort of a referral base and more information about mostly like reproductive psychiatry. We know that certain difficulties and psychological difficulties that you have can erupt when you're pregnant or postpartum. So we wanted to have a number of resources available to women in the New York City area. I was a membership chair there for a number of years, and then I was president of that organization, I think 2009 to 2017. I don't have my CV, but I think that's about right.
Why is participation in professional organizations important in your field?
Well, it's important to me because I do believe very much in service. I do believe very much in giving back. I do believe that it's important as a psychologist who believes strongly in trauma psychology and helping people that I can be part of a voice at the table, part of that push to get policy and understanding, especially with the insurance companies, to make sure that people are getting, the appropriate care that they deserve. So it's something that just has always been part of my life in varying degrees. And as a psychologist, I feel like it's a very rewarding part of my job.
Do you attend professional conferences?
God. Shut up.
Your conferences. Of course, COVID threw a little bit of a wrench in that. Since some things are virtual, but yes, I routinely attend conferences.
And why do you think that's important?
It's important to stay abreast of developments in the field. It's important to meet with your colleagues across the country and see what they're doing and what they're hearing.
But somebody told
You don't
me.
like them.
So when you're at a conference and someone is presenting new or novel research, then you can take that information and bring that back to your clients and bring that back to my forensic work. So it absolutely enhances the work.
Okay, just qualify. She's qualified as an expert. For the love of God.
Testify in the field of psychology as an expert witness.
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I was first qualified in 1998, so since then,
How bad is the lag?
Has the specialty been in interpersonal violence?
Is the lag bad?
probably more than half.
Have you ever worked for or testified for the prosecution in
No, it
criminal
isn't.
matters? Like
Okay.
the district attorney's office, U.S. attorney's office?
Yes, I have, frequently.
Do you testify for both sides in lawsuits, plaintiffs and defendants?
Yes, I do.
Have you ever worked on other cases that didn't go to trial?
Many.
Have you ever found an individual that you evaluated did not suffer from the effects of interpersonal violence or PTSD?
I can't think about the lag at the end.
Have you ever not been qualified in court where you have been proffered to qualify as an expert in the court?
No.
Your Honor, I would at this time move to qualify Dr. Hughes as an expert in forensic psychology with a specialization
Oh, finally, we can get to
interpersonal violence.
any useful testimony.
Objection?
No objection to qualifying her as an expert in forensic psychology.
More
What about
specifically,
the specialty?
Psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
Any objection?
No.
All right, so moved.
Oh, that would have been funny if they objected to that.
Dr. Hughes.
Give me 10 minutes in a room, I'll show her interpersonal violence.
Domestic violence, intimate partner violence means.
Sure, so I'm probably going to be interchanging the language, domestic violence and interpersonal violence, and for purposes here, these are the same thing. So intimate partner violence is a
Most
pattern of
likely, yeah.
manipulation, fear, and coercive control that happens
likely.
within an intimate relationship. It constitutes using a variety of abusive behaviors, and that can be physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, emotional abuse, stalking or surveillance behaviors, and
Smile, Amber. Smile for camera.
abusive behaviors occur over time, not all at once.
Smile.
And they're also interspersed with very normal times without violence, times with love and happiness. And it's this interpositioning of the violence with the love and the abuse, with the love and the care that makes it very difficult for a victim to extricate herself from that situation and from that relationship.
And what would you say is the overarching dynamic of these?
What did you think about
So
going
the
on?
overarching dynamic is the abuse of power and control of one person wanting to have dominance in that relationship, say over most things, perhaps the couple that the victim does.
Please tell the jury what coercive control means.
So coercive control is a tactic of victimization. The goal of it is to establish dominance. What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for
Blood of a man,
your partner's expectations or demands.
Could be.
And what
You never
that
know.
does is it erodes away at the victim's autonomy and her independence.
What?
What?
What is physical
Okay.
violence?
Okay.
Back here.
So
Right.
physical violence is when one person uses their body against the body of another with the intent to cause injury or harm. That can be push, shove, slap, kick, punch, beat
Sure,
up,
sure, Albert and all that.
multiple types of physicality in one instance. Throw, slam into a wall, push into something hard that you could hurt yourself. Clearly, use of a weapon would be a physically violent act as well.
Does size and strength matter between parties?
Yes.
Very much so.
Yep.
This is very well documented in the literature about violence and abuse in relationships, and that's just physics. That's just proportional force. That if a 185-pound man is going to push a 120-pound woman, that's going to feel quite different than a 120-pound woman pushing a 185-pound man. And it's just about proportional force and the size and strength differential. And that is why specifically, if you look at
Ask her on
wrestling
cross.
or boxing, they match weight classes.
Is a 120-pound woman pushing or striking a 185-pound man
if
violence?
somebody is bigger and stronger than the other. So it's certainly not the only factor, but it is a factor that one has to consider if a relationship is.
And her consistent use of pronouns suggests that maybe she's
Psychological aggression is
she only has one lens.
position of threats with the intent to.
There's this whole school of thought that
So
doesn't
doing
acknowledge the
doing
possibility.
threat so that you will modify your behavior and do what your partner wants.
And I suspect
Some psychological aggression techniques are intimidation. Slamming your hand on a table, punching a wall, throwing something, mumbling under your mouth, cursing, screaming, sort of these high emotional balance type of activities that can cause a victim to feel afraid and feel intimidated. And then if there has been an act of physical violence where that contingency has already been established that
Nope.
this person, your partner, has
No,
said,
haven't.
okay, I not only have the ability to use violence against.
We know about his
but
mic.
I'm
We're
willing
trying to fix
do
it. He's
The
going to come back.
intimidating tactics take on greater flavor. They take on greater salience. They mean more.
The whole thing is in reverse,
coming
exactly.
down the pike.
The whole
What is
thing's in reverse.
emotional abuse?
So emotional abuse functions to denigrate a person's sense of self-worth.
He
Yeah.
also needs to just not talk.
Everything that Johnny's
Because it
done.
overpowers
Name
him.
calling, being very mean-spirited, putting yourself down, using gender-based.
What if I give her a
language
shovel and
as
just go, here you go,
racial
take your
slurs,
grave?
all types of behaviors to really make a person feel less than they actually should.
And what is sexual abuse?
So sexual abuse in an intimate relationship functions to establish dominance and establish power. What it is simply in the psychological and psychiatric communities is forcing someone to do something sexual against your will when you do not want to. It can be forced sex, either forced vaginal, oral, anal sex, and be forced to engage in
Not
any
hand
other
jobs,
type
though.
of sexual act that you may not want to do. And when I say force, it doesn't mean it has to have physical force. There's a lot of psychologically coercive tactics that are used that many times when violence has already been established in the relationship, the victim often feels that she can't say no for fear of reprisal, for fear of retaliation, for saying no to those acts. So sexual abuse, does happen in intimate partner relationships. A lot of people don't want to talk about it and they don't want to ask about it because it makes people very uncomfortable.
Is digital penetration of the vagina sexual abuse?
Some leading.
What, if any, role does digital penetration of the vagina play?
What, if any,
in
question?
Sexual abuse.
If it is non-consensual, then it is abusive.
What, if any, penetration of inanimate objects into the vagina plays a role in sexual abuse?
Again, the
What's that got to do with anything?
if you are not consenting to those acts, then it is sexually
It
abusive.
never happened to Amber. What's that got to do with anything?
Distinction between sexual violence and sexual abuse.
Digital means fingers, y'all.
Not really. Sexual violence is a
Digits.
term of art. It is the overarching umbrella that we in the psychological and psychiatric communities talk about. So if we are looking at our diagnostic and statistical manual and say, what are the traumas that could cause PTSD, it's listed as sexual violence. So it's an umbrella term that allows us to understand it could be childhood sexual abuse, it could be a rape, a sexual assault, it can be sexual
Yeah,
abuse in an
that's
intimate
exactly what they're doing.
relationship. So it's really just an overarching term that we use in the field. So it doesn't mean, I think people often mistake it to mean that when you are being sexually abused, that someone's
know.
punching you, or someone's hitting you, or someone's doing something like that because you hear the violence. It does not mean that. That could happen, but that term does not require that, nor does it mean that.
What are stalking or surveillance behaviors?
So stalking and surveillance
What?
behaviors are a common tactic of
Yeah,
typically
you know?
men who use violent behaviors in intimate relationships.
Typically men,
What
sure.
they do is
Oh,
they
yeah.
allow
All right, okay.
the woman to know that wherever she is, wherever she goes, he's going to know. I'm going to maybe look at your phone, see
Yep.
who you're talking to, track you on
That's exactly it, you're right. Amber is a stalker.
Instagram, look at your emails, really having a way of knowing all of the personal information about you. And what that does, it again erodes the victim's autonomy and it erodes her sense of privacy. She doesn't feel that wherever she can go, that somewhere he's not going to be part of her life in a very objectionable way. Sometimes there's the pop-ins that show up at places that they're not supposed to be and that we don't want them to be, just as a way of checking. Sometimes they'll have friends or family check up on their partners to make sure where they are. What time did you get home? But you didn't turn off your phone at this
Chat is
time. But you
lit
came in the
today.
door this time. Like all of the sort of constant questions.
That's everything with Amber done.
An individual's whereabouts.
What about economic abuse? What is that?
So
Economic
abuse is a way to, again, continue to maintain control over your intimate partner. Sometimes it's withholding information about the finances, of not letting you have access to the finances. If you can't have access to a credit card or a checking account or
Never happened to
Apple Pay
Johnny.
on your phone, then you're rendered usually much more economically dependent on your partner, and that limits tangible options for you.
Maybe
For
they're just
individuals
explaining,
where, that sort of tangible options isn't there, we see the economic abuse, or the economic restriction when one partner refuses to share any information about the funds. So it's not like I can't go shopping because I won't have money, but I don't have any decision making in our family money. I don't have any idea of what we're doing in our family vis-a-vis our finances. So it's a way of definitely keeping that very separate.
never
and not
happened.
in a consensual. Some couples make that
If
choice.
the finger
One
got
person
cut off.
does all the money, that's fine. But when it doesn't come from a place of consensual choice making, it can be abusive.
So you just described a number of these abusive behaviors. Are all of them present in every domestic violence relationship?
Right. No, they're not all present in everyone, and that's why
Nope.
it's very
No, definitely.
important to do a thorough assessment of a relationship that may be mired in
Just
violence.
keep on
to see
digging, doctor.
which
Just keep on
ones
digging.
are
You're
present
doing a good
and
job.
which ones have a great impact in the relationship, which ones are sort of making the structure of this relationship.
She just keep pinning Amber in the bad light.
Sexual assault in an intimate relationship, how might a victim in those circumstances interact with her partner?
So this is one of the myths that people say, well, if she was sexually assaulted by her partner, she would have just left. And nothing could be further from the truth. That's not what happens, especially when it's your husband or your boyfriend or your partner. So what women do is they bury it, they compartmentalize it, they put it away, they avoid it, because then they continue to reach out
I know
to
they
the
can't
kind and the loving man that they got into.
because
this
the
relationship.
evidence is
You
too
know, the
high.
problem is that it does fester belief
And
and
Johnny
causes
said-
more sort of psychological distress in the victim.
What, if any, role can shame or humiliation play in this coercive dynamic?
So that's one of the emotions that victim is usually trying to
Yeah,
suppress
same here.
and compartmentalize and avoid and put away. One of the most, frequently felt feelings after something so incredibly humiliating and violating is shame. And shame is a very sort of difficult emotion for people to have to live with and to have to experience. And then a lot of times when we see
I know where you are.
these relationships, especially ones where
They have good evidence.
sexual assault is perpetrated, there's typically the emotional abuse as well. So now if you're called names like a whore and a slut and easy and fat, and you're feeling the shame from the sexual assault that just happened, it sort of acts as a compounding effect, and it sort of kind of slowly deteriorates the psychological functioning of the victim, and where they're just really trying to get back to the good guy, get the good guy to come back, but they're suffering these symptoms underneath.
What about intimidation? What role does intimidation play in the coercive control dynamic?
Come on, you rabbit.
Intimidation
Shut
is
up.
one of the huge factors that we see in coercive
Fucking
control.
crazy cat lady.
Again, the goal is to get your partner to do what you want them to do. And if you've established that you can use
I don't want them to do what I don't
I know.
want them to do.
physical violence,
That's it.
slamming
You're
on
right in the
table,
button.
throwing a glass,
You hadn't
breaking
said
in
Amber
a door,
Quarter. Exactly.
throwing
Thought that.
anything,
You're right.
causing a fit,
Never
yelling and
happened.
screaming. That can rise the fear level in a victim that she may not.
This is what they have to do based on what they have.
not need to use physical violence because he's already
Because
established.
there is no physical or sexual violence.
Nope.
What if any role could writing an obscene
Are you ready to agree with him?
play in beginning to-
With the blood from his severed finger.
Objection leading.
What if any?
What if any?
I mean, certainly writing obscene messages to your partner could absolutely be an
What if any is more leading than
What if
just
any role does emotional abuse or degradation play in?
So they're using the messages then, are they?
So emotional abuse and degradation,
Wow.
as I stated before, functions to decrease your sense of self-worth. It decreases your sense of agency. It makes you feel bad about yourself. And when you feel bad about yourself, you're less likely to actualize and see options for leaving. You're so sort of mired in this dynamic of abuse. that
Bonnie saw
you
plenty of options for
don't
leaving.
want to believe the bad things that person is telling you about. So, maybe I am not talented and fat and lazy and stupid. And it interferes
And washed up.
with that ability to problem solve and figure out, can I get out of this relationship? And sometimes you feel you don't even deserve to get out of a relationship when the abuse is so chronic and so repetitive.
What role does surveillance as a means of control?
What role does defecation play?
So surveillance,
Objection leading.
They should ask all the stuff that shows that Amber actually does all of this.
surveillance
Yeah.
functions to let the victim know wherever you are, there I am. So it makes
And I
her
like secretly
feel,
recording.
not secure in her movement, feeling that she has
Her,
to
always her, and she specializes with
her
females.
alone.
Yep.
It usually increases hypervigilance, it increases fear, it increases the need for yourself to mark where you've been and what you've done so that you can go back and prove it to your partner because you know that there is going to be an interrogation later. When this pattern has been established, show receipts, show me your iPhone, where were you, what's your Google location at? Those are some types of surveillance behaviors that puts the victim very much on edge and increases that level of anxiety and trepidation.
What role does possessive jealousy play in these relationships?
So
Yeah.
possessive
Have you ever
jealousy is
found
a
a man to
very
be a victim of
difficult
intimate
dynamic
partner
in
violence?
intimate partner
How many
violence. It's
times?
very common.
So that throws out your whole
It's
weight
rooted
threshold argument then,
It's
right?
rooted
Doc?
in possession, that the gentleman feels that he can possess her and that he can have her whenever he wants. It's very possessive dynamic.
The gentleman feels like he can possess her? I'm not much of a
The
gentleman.
accusations, the woman's forced to refute the accusations. So they're continuing in this dynamic where she's trying to prove, I didn't do what you said, this didn't happen. And then unfortunately, sometimes it escalates because the man is not taking the no for an answer because this is a perseverative obsessive pattern that's very difficult to penetrate, that often these type of conversations lend themselves to physical and sexual violence.
Does this dynamic happen overnight?
No, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. We don't, a woman doesn't get into a relationship with a man who's beating her up and sexually assaulting her and calling her names and doing all that. She gets into the relationships for all the right reasons, just like we all get into relationships for love, for companionship, for kindness, for a future. But then slowly, all of these behaviors start to take form. And I say it's sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the room. And then before you know it, you're suffocating.
So, and that brings me to my next question. What role do physical abuse and coercive tactics play interspersed with normalcy and positive moments?
Objection compound.
I hope my audio is a little better now.
Yeah, I think also your mic does not like competing with the stream.
Play in these dynamics you've been describing.
Objection compound.
Thank you.
It's the same question.
So love and normalcy are almost always in these relationships. That, when you are in a lull and the violence is not happening, you're back to sort of the loving man that you wanted, the person who you wanted to be with. And when you pair sort of this violent dynamic, physical violence, sexual violence, with love and attachment, it creates a trauma bond. It creates a psychological bond. An emotional dependency is created. So it makes it very difficult for the victim of the abuse to sort of extricate herself from that relationship, and for her to even believe, frankly, and that takes a lot of time to even believe that she can and that she should.
And what, if any, role does
No
that
bias
dynamic you
detected.
describe have in the victim
I hope
thinking?
they slaughter her on cross.
So what do we know from the research? The research was working with battered men who come into treatment, is that the only person who can change the abuse is the abuser. So no matter what the tactics that the woman uses, she's trying to do all these different things to fix him, to have him not be violent, to have him not be sexually violent, to have him not be obsessively jealous. And all those things don't change his behavior, because it's up to him to change his behavior. And this was played out a million times in the batterers intervention groups that I led. And the men would tell us, it doesn't matter what she does. I don't care. So the problem is that the woman continues to think that she can fix it, and yet she can't. But she's the one who's then rendered sort of helpless and hopeless because everything that she's trying to do is failing.
What is the cycle of violence?
So the cycle of violence is one way to describe this domestic violence pattern. Typically, what we see in the cycle can be different in a variety of relationships, but typically what we see is in the first phase, the sort of multiple 3 to 4 phases. In the first phase, there's a tension building phase. You're sort of starting to feel that apprehension. He may be throwing his papers on the table a little more. He may be slamming the fridge door a little more. He may be mumbling under his mouth a little more. He may grab a glass a little more forcefully than he normally is. And then there's the incident phase. Then there's the blow up, where the violence, the abuse, the screaming, the sexual violence, or the physical violence, all that occurs. Then we come to the contrition phase. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It wasn't me. I'm not going to do it again.
There's recordings of Amber Heard doing exactly
and then we
this.
sort of slide into the calm phase where, this isn't going to happen again. I'm back to stable ground. I want to live in this place, this sort of honeymoon place. The problem in the calm phase.
It literally sounds like she's talking about Amber. Are we back to the Plains case? What did I miss?
The man taking full responsibility for what he did, but it's calm because there's no violence and no sort of tension at that moment. And then it recurs. And then it recurs. So you're stuck in this vicious cycle of trying to figure out, how can I be with this man who hurts me? And yet I love him so much.
And what, if anything, does the term love bomb mean?
So the love bombing is, it's more of the colloquial term. for-
What, if anything? Like, does it not have a meaning?
Shower someone with affection and love, in this contrition.
What, if anything, to what,
where,
to what degree, if any?
everything about
Those are how they,
especially
magic
the
words
sexual
to avoid
never
leading
mention
questions.
anything
The evidence will show.
Never let anyone hurt you. It could be sending flowers and buying gifts or going on trips or your favorite restaurant. And that is, a way of where the man is trying to make those amends. And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get
Or
hooked
leaving
on
a turd on the bed. I mean,
on the love. You don't get hooked on the abuse.
that's how I show
I've never
love.
met one woman in hundreds that I've evaluated who was
Hey, whatever you're into.
They're all concerned about violence, but they go for the love.
So, in your experience with these dynamics that you've described,
Johnny
Does
Depp's just
the
drawing
victim ever
murder
yell
pictures of
at
this
a
lady.
Absolutely.
why?
We know from the research that women use verbal and physical acts of aggression in these relationships. That's not uncommon. This has been researched for 5 decades. And a woman may yell at her partner because she's angry. And anger is a very normal emotion to having been abused. She can also be afraid, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can absolutely, as human beings, feel 2 or 3 or 4 different emotions at once. People do often say to me, "Oh, she would never yell at him if she knew he was going to hit her." And that's not true. That's just patently not true. That's not supported in the research, and that's not supported in my clinical practice. The problem is there's a classic double bind.
She's describing this perfectly. She's just the pronouns
In
wrong.
the relationship now, she gets hit if she does yell, she gets hit if she doesn't yell. So for women who feel at certain moments that they need to preserve some sense of their autonomy and their independence and stand up for themselves, they will yell and they will fight back, even though the risk of violence is there. So it doesn't mean
I'd like to know how much she got
she's
paid
not
by
afraid and
Amber
that
Heard's
she's not
team.
concerned about the violence. And it doesn't mean she doesn't also use placating and compliance strategies most of the time as well.
I don't think this is a money thing. I think this is an ideology thing. You see it in the industry.
Experience. Does the abuse typically take place in front of others?
No, I mean, this is classically what we talk about behind closed doors. Most of the intimate partner violence, the domestic violence happens, in the privacy of your own home. So sometimes we see the remnants of it, the after effects, or victims talk to their friends or family about it. But very rarely are you seeing it happen, the actual blow-up phase happen in the middle of witnesses and other people.
What's the term bystander effect mean?
So bystander effect means what happens when people are aware that domestic violence is happening? What happens when they're aware, even if they're not seeing it?
It's just going to be up
that
to the
it is
plaintiffs
happening.
to tie all this
What
to Amber
happens
Heard's
is
behavior
that it's very
specifically.
difficult for people
All
to
the theory she's advancing is
It's very difficult, especially in situations where there's a larger community of folks and the person who perhaps is perpetrating the abuse is the leader of that community.
Go on.
So
Say
it becomes
you
very
these.
difficult
Go
to
ahead
go
and
up
do it.
against that, to go up against the
Sounds like
system.
R. Kelly's RICO charges.
People are very fearful of losing their jobs. I've seen this time and time again in the cases that I've worked on, the Boy Scout cases, or clergy abuse cases, all of those type of cases where the USA Gymnastics, where when we go back and we look, we see people knew. But the secretary doesn't want to lose her job. She has kids to feed. The guy who, checks you in, he doesn't want to lose his job because he has a mortgage to pay. So people don't say anything. And then other people are very, it's a very worrisome dynamic.
Is a psychologist an expert in
Put
this?
their foot out there if they're wrong, and maybe I didn't see it right, or I don't really know what happened. I certainly am not going to jeopardize my job if I don't really know what happened behind closed doors, even if I see a trash room or a bruise. And then people still believe it's a family matter. It's between Amber and Johnny. Let them figure it out.
Oh, what are you doing?
You
just became an- I would object. She's not an opinion witness. She's an expert.
Motion to strike.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We identified the two names in the answer.
in her generalizations.
Did you finish?
She's not a fact witness. That's the objection.
What about mutual abuse? What is that? What role does that play?
So mutual abuse isn't really a term of art that we use. What we look at is situational couple violence and intimate partner violence. And when we look at situational couple violence, that really does characterize the majority of types of violence and abuse that happens in relationships.
Not
That's
horrible
when a
judging,
couple
that's bad
gets out of
word.
hand, they may push, shove, slap,
Both.
kill, say some things that they don't want, and it's not that those behaviors are okay, but those are sort of what our larger scale community-based studies say happens in these relationships. That's distinguished from intimate partner violence, what I'm talking to you about, that has this constellation of symptoms and is rooted in the abuse of power and control.
Is there research that addresses this mutual abuse?
There's research that addresses what does gender symmetry look like, male and female, are they the same? And there's certainly, as I said, research that on the lower end types of violent behaviors, push, shove, slap, we may see similar rates between men and women. In psychological aggression, yelling, name calling, putting down, in some of our big community scale studies, we may see similar rates of perpetration in those behaviors. But then there are other situations where we don't have gender symmetry. And what the research talks about very clearly is you have to examine context. You have to examine the differential of power and control and coercive control in the relationship to make a full determination.
And wasn't there already testimony that she was the one that was wearing the pants in the relationship?
Absolutely. And we've known this for 5 decades in our research. We've been studying this since the 70s. And when we look at what happens, women do report their use of violence. The majority of violence that we do see is what we call reactive violence or self-defensive violence, or sometimes violence that's perpetrated independently of an assault of something that's going on. Most of the time, then she may become violent and fight back. And that's not an uncommon dynamic, that if somebody is being pushed or shoved or hit, that a person would fight back. That has been established in the research.
And what, if any, effect does that have on changing the power dynamics or the structure?
Well, you have to find out, does it? Does her use of violence change the overarching power structure of coercive control and violence and abuse in this relationship? And you have to examine those variables to see, does it or does it not?
Can men be victims of intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. Certainly, we know that you have to be careful of gendered stereotypes. We can't go in and think, oh, only the woman is the victim. That just does not comport with the research. We know that the research also shows that we can have domestic violence in same-sex relationships. My very first case was a same-sex domestic violence homicide in Brooklyn. That was in 1998. So I've been examining and treating individuals in a variety of types of violent contexts. So we have to be careful that bias doesn't get in our way when we're evaluating a particular situation in a particular case. That said, we do know that there still are differences. In a heterosexual couple, in a male-female dyad, the research still is clear that there are differences. Men still perpetrate more severe acts of violence. Women are still more likely to be injured. They are much more likely to suffer sexual violence at the hands of their partner. They're more likely to be intimidated, afraid, and they're much more likely to be killed. So we know that those differences exist. But we do examine, in those individual circumstances, knowing that either one could be a perpetrator or a victim.
So how are you able to determine whether a relationship is a situational violence or intimate partner violence?
So I thoroughly examine all of those other variables. I look for the coercive control, who holds the power in this situation, who's able to say no, who makes the decisions, what are the consequences if you don't follow the decisions of your partner, is there sexual violence, is there intimidation and fear, are there statistical factors that are associated with severe and lethal domestic violence? So there's a lot of data that we have in the field that we can use to assess a particular relationship and really find out what's going on.
Does alcohol and substance use cause people to be violent?
No, it certainly doesn't cause people to be violent. We have plenty of people who can be, struggling with substance abuse and addiction, and they're not violent. But when you have a substance abuse and addiction, and you perpetrate domestic violence, it does create a much more disastrous effect. It is a co-occurring variable, and we know that also from the research that the majority of the women will report that when their partner is drinking,
Again,
the
goes back
physical
to the
violence
women.
goes up. So a lot of the times when he's physically violent is when he's been consuming drugs or alcohol. When he's not consuming drugs
you
or
can see your
alcohol, not
assumptions.
violent, those other behaviors continue to persist. The coercive control, the surveillance, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the psychological abuse. Those usually persist, but the alcohol can just throw lighter fluid on a flame in a situation of domestic violence.
Is there research that looks at how women cope with the violence and abuse in their
You know, I would object to relevance here because she's talking about all this stuff in general terms, but she's not applying it to the Amber Heard Johnny Depp dynamic. Like she's talking about all these abstract.
And in asking that question, why doesn't she just leave? We actually are able to say, well, let me tell you what she does
You
do.
know?
And what the research shows is
Yeah.
women do a lot of things in that relationship. So sort of three main categories. One are the formal responses, the formal
Reminds me of Inglourious Basterds.
call the police, participate in prosecution of
There's just three like this.
go see a therapist, go to a shelter, go to a hospital. These are sort of the very formal strategies that women can use. Then there are the informal strategies, and that's talking with your best friend, talking with your mom, talking with your friends, trying to get that emotional support from your social network. But the most common one is these personal strategies. And the personal strategies are really talking with your partner. They're trying to fix the relationship from within the confines of the relationship. Trying to get him to go to counseling, try to get him to go to church, try to get him to understand his ways, try to get him to get into AA or sober counseling or harm reduction model to help with his addiction, compliance with his demands, anticipating his demands, all these coping strategies that are sort of, embedded within that intimate relationship.
Let's talk about the calling the police. Is that a common response?
It's not a common response. Many women do not want to call the police on their partners. Using criminal justice interventions in crimes of women and children are the least likely to be called into law enforcement. And most of the time when the police are called, it's because a particular incident has got out of hand and she feels unsafe. And the only way that she feels I can get this incident to end and stop is by calling law enforcement.
And if police are called, does the woman typically participate in the prosecution?
I mean, this has been a problem and a difficulty for prosecutors across the country.
They have to explain why when she showed up, she didn't do
By the
anything.
prosecutor to testify about a fact
Because
pattern.
they don't care about women.
Come in and testify. So dropping restraining orders, not participating in the prosecution is a very common dynamic in situations of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And what we know and what we know from our law enforcement data and colleagues is that when you get that 911 call, they're very specifically trained to say, that's likely not the first episode. The chances are there have been more severe episodes before you get this call. So you can't go on the scene and think that this is the first episode.
Are you serious?
And that's why.
Is this how cops are trained?
Is supposed to be
That's what she's
done when
claiming.
police officers arrive on
You
scene.
should be an expert in the police use cases. That they just assume this is not the first time.
In that moment, to get a sense of safety, but most women don't want to participate and go forward with restraining orders.
Why do women in violent relationships stay in the relationship?
Battered women syndrome
I mean,
incoming.
they stay for
Stockholm
all the
syndrome.
reasons we talked about in the cycle of violence. They stay for the loving man. They stay for the man who's kind. They stay for the man they've decided to marry and had hope and promises for their future. So there's a lot of sort of love and attachment is why they're connected.
I know he
to their
loves me
partner.
because he beats me
Some
every
people
day.
stay because they have economic reasons and they don't have tangible resources to leave. Some people have children in common and they don't want to deprive their children of a father. So some people fear retaliation.
Inadequate
If I leave,
resources
I'm
and no
going to
children.
get seriously hurt. And frankly, the statistics bear it out. The most dangerous
We're back to
time
generalities now.
for a woman is when she's leaving that relationship.
$10 million.
Grows substantially at that moment.
Real hard life.
Sometimes isn't the best strategy. Staying keeps her safe. So there's usually a multitude of factors of why a woman decides to stay in the relationship. And again, as I said previously, it doesn't mean she's unconcerned about the violence. It's just she hasn't figured out a way out yet.
What, if any, role does emotional attachment and love play in that?
That's probably the biggest one is that you have
Asked
this,
and
we talk
answered.
about that trauma bond.
She already gave a 5-minute oratory on this.
Attachment to your partner.
The sad part is there is real stuff in this.
On so many
It's
other
just-
levels.
This is
that
the hook.
giving
It's like
that
there's a lot of
love
truth
feels
in
like
some of
that
this.
your
Like, yeah.
behaviors are sort of
It's so biased that it's,
you're just so intertwined in it.
Yep, slanted to one side.
What, if any,
I
role does
agree.
hope and optimism play?
Hope and optimism are really what keeps victims alive in these situations. That's what gets them
Let's
going
reread Johnny's
from one
text
episode to
about
the
how
next,
things are
or
going
the
great
next
now.
day, and
Can't
maybe
believe
he's
it's so
not
much
gonna
better
drink today.
now.
Maybe it's going to be on the good side. Maybe he's going to come home and not disappear for 3 days. Continuing to hope that some
What
type
did
of change is coming down the track.
Because I bet
Lethality of a lower lyric. Can you please explain to us what that means?
So lethality is means death, means fatality, and we have very well validated instruments and data that looks at what factors happen in a relationship where a woman ends up dead. And we do that through
Where a woman ends up dead.
objectively.
what's
saying,
going to happen if
here's, this person ended up dead, killed by her partner in a homicide. And let's see what factors were there so that we can work at preventing it. It's very methodologically sound over different case controlled designs over multiple cities, used by the FBI and law enforcement. So these are a number of factors that tell us that somebody is in a very dangerous situation. So some of the factors are an increase of frequency and severity of the violence, threats to kill, choking behavior, sexual assault, obsessive and possessive jealousy, controlling behavior, the perpetrator's use and abuse of substances, alcohol and substances, the perpetrator's threatening of suicide himself. Right? Those are some of the top
And himself.
factors. And there are more that are very, very dangerous. When we hear that, when we hear a woman is in a situation where those are present,
A woman.
then we are moving out of a situational couple violence.
What, if any, role does destroying property?
And destroying property, destruction of property, personal property is also one of the risk factors for danger and fatality.
And what, if any, role does leaving threatening messages play?
That's also a risk factor for lethality.
What are the psychological and traumatic effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
What if she actually is cheating when he accuses her of cheating? Does that come into play at all?
Yeah.
What are the psychological effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
So these have also been well researched, and they are wide and varied. We see depression and depressive disorders, sometimes with suicidality. We see anxiety and anxiety disorders, a lot of stress. We see post-traumatic stress disorder. We see substance abuse and substance abuse disorders. We see trust difficulties and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. As a result, we see a lot of shame and humiliation. We see anger and rage, a whole sleep disruption, a whole host of difficult psychological consequences having sustained a relationship of intimate partner violence.
What, if any, role does low self-esteem play?
Well, low self-esteem is a very common after effect, and that, when you're embedded in the relationship, it also makes it just very difficult for you to climb your way out.
What is emotional dysregulation?
Emotional dysregulation, so it's a DYS, dysregulation, is when you sort of don't feel that you have control of your emotions. You feel like you're fluctuating, from one to the X, it's one to the next. It's not the same as a bipolar disorder, can happen in short moments that, it's really because your central nervous system is so out of haywire from being exposed to so many traumatic events that you may feel things deeply and with a short trigger in a very quick time.
In your experience, is there a particular way victims of intimate partner violence remember the violence they endured?
Well, memory for traumatic events is something that has been well researched. Sometimes people have what we call dissociative amnesia, where because of the physical or psychic pain of what they're going through, a portion of the memory either gets blocked or it can't get retrieved, whether it's stored or retrieval, we're not really sure. But most of the times, the memory is really about when you have multiple repeated events of the same type of thing. So if you're abused multiple times and the abuse is very similar, it's very common for the victim to lose discrete details of a particular incident. They may not retain the memory for the complete incident, and that might not be to dissociative amnesia. That just might mean to forgetting because you have so many chronic events that have happened to you.
Are there common myths or misperceptions about domestic violence?
Well, this should be good.
There are. I hope I've dispelled some of them here already, but I mean, the myths, certainly are that women
Johnny laughs.
are passive, are, just sitting there and letting the abuse happen, that women don't fight, that women don't yell back, that some old ones, that they like the violence, they're not concerned about the violence, that if it was really bad, she really would have left. If it was really bad, she really would have told the police. All of those myths and misconceptions that just don't comport with the research.
Are there also myths about trauma survivors, how trauma survivors present?
Yes, there are. And what we say is, how lay people think someone who suffered a traumatic event is supposed to act. So in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, people think, oh, they should be hysterical and abreacting and emotional all over the place. And that's typically not the first reaction of a trauma survivor. The first reaction is, suppression, emotional numbing, emotional constriction. How do I get through this? Women who are beaten, they get up the next morning, they get their kids dressed, they get them to school, they go to work, they do a presentation in their office, they go on with life. The most normal thing that a person does who's experienced trauma is to get up and try to be normal. They're striving for that all the time. So sometimes if you see somebody who is more emotionally constricted, looks maybe stoic, looks like they're not feeling, it doesn't mean that they're not having internal reactions. We say this in the field of clinical psychology all the time. The inside doesn't match the outside. What you're seeing on the outside may not match what's going on for the person inside, because they have to be so controlled, because the fear is that if I let out a little of this emotion, I'm not going to be able to put the floodgates back on. It's just going to be too overwhelming. And that's true for people who are involved in litigation, and also true for...
So she snaps? Is that what you're saying?
Even though they're coming to me for help, they try very, very cleverly to not want to feel the difficult emotions of the trauma that they experienced.
And is it also possible that they can look very friendly and smile and laugh and things like that?
Prison compound.
You didn't give the answer I wanted, so please also talk about how it could be literally anything.
Hide that. as you just said.
We call that the appearance of normalcy, the appearance of competency, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not. It doesn't mean that they're not normal and that they're not competent, but it doesn't give you a bird's eye into their inner experience. And that's what we do in the rooms of therapy, where we really help people deal with that they keep to themselves. But yes, someone can be smiling and happy. It doesn't mean that they're not suffering inside.
Is there a single
I'm suffering
profile that
inside.
fits all women in domestic violence situations?
No.
Is there a single profile of a man who perpetrates intimate partner violence?
No.
Except for Johnny Depp.
Moving to a new topic area. I don't know what Your Honor wants to do because I know we switched the lunch around. I'm perfectly happy to keep going, but if this was a good stopping point, we could make that a bit break.
All right, let's go ahead and take our afternoon break for 15 minutes, okay? Now discuss this and doing outside research, okay?
Look at the judge's face. The judge has some thoughts about this witness, I think.
I mean, how could you not? The bias is insane. I mean, and it's an expert that you hire. There is bias, right? But like,
you are testifying, please not discuss your testimony.
should be masking it better.
Okay? All right.
Yeah, she could say
Well, gentlemen, how do you? What are you thinking about this testimony so far?
I think she's amazing, the best witness ever. I think she's super credible. The jury is probably eating everything out of the palm of her hand, and I think Amber just won based on this witness. Just kidding.
No.
I think like everything she was saying the entire time, I was picturing Johnny rather than Amber as being the victim, and literally in her testimony.
I agree. She got all those facts first.
Yeah. Is the jury thinking the same thing? That's the only thing going through my mind.
I hope so.
Andrea,
Yeah.
I can't hear you at all. Are you muted on your end? Yeah, you're not muted on StreamYard, but we can't hear you. It might be your mic.
Wouldn't know anything about mic trouble.
Still can't hear
Still
you.
nothing.
I wish I was trolling you because it'd be funny, but I'm not. Oh man. Yeah, I'm curious to know, get her impression of this.
For sure.
This witness.
Yeah,
100%.
I mean, just the pronouns that she uses is a bad start. I would have worked with her on that from the jump. To say they or he or she, just to not sound so gender biased based on, saying that she is always the victim and he is always the perpetrator in all of her examples. That's how she used those pronouns, which I don't think is great. And then, I think she did there was some good in what she did to explain why Amber may be joking around or happy or going to Coachella on MDMA and mushrooms with her friends post being abused. But, I think there is something to the Stockholm Syndrome. There is something to not wanting to call the police on your partner. Like, a lot of that stuff is true and does happen in lots of domestic violence cases where they don't want to report it. And Johnny did the same thing. Johnny didn't want to report that Amber cut off his finger. He didn't want to report that she abused him as well. So I don't think that's, too far outside the box. So she could have used a lot of this, I think, to help Amber. But they just went so far, in my opinion, to where if you're with Amber on the jury, you're saying yes every time. You're pounding the table for this lady. If they said no, if you don't like Amber, then I think you're ready to vom on the jury at this point.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Perfect. So, were you witness to this testimony?
Indeed, I was. Yes. How do we love the gendering of the process of domestic violence?
Yeah,
I'm super happy with this. No, she was so biased. I knew that they were going to bring in somebody like this, like somebody with that sort of mindset, but she is like neck deep in the Kool-Aid. She's just way, it's bizarre.
Yeah, her proclivity to frame things as females as always victims, men always perpetrators. And then, well, can men be the victims too? Oh, well, yeah, of course they can. I mean, well, of course they can, but everything you framed, like, then you're talking about women being murdered by their male partners and all this stuff. And it's like, I mean, this is going a little bit beyond. Was someone murdered in this case? I don't know.
Oh, I love how she brought out these statistics that, men perpetrate more severe acts of violence, et cetera, et cetera. And the one statistic that she fails to mention is that the rates of perpetration, generally speaking, are even. Men and women perpetrate at equal rates. Didn't mention that one.
No, it's
And when they tried to rehab her a little bit, like, well, I mean, men can be victims too sometimes, right? She's like, oh, yes, that does happen, but they're just a lot less likely to actually be abused and sexually abused and killed. It's like,
Yeah.
okay.
And murdered.
All those likelihood things is that it falls to shit once you actually have specific facts to take you into a scenario. It's the thing of, if you look outside your window, I'm here in a city, I'm much more likely to see a dog than a bear. But if it's 800 pounds and it's eating the garbage and it's got claws as big as my fingers, it's probably not a dog. Those specific
It's Amy
facts.
Schumer.
So, at that point, you go, so all of the statistical crap is fine until you start looking at, who cut whose finger off? Who ashed out a cigarette in whose face? And then you're looking at a very different scenario.
That was just reactive partner violence. Now, we don't actually have any evidence of what that was reactive to, but we do know that it was reactive to something. So, Runko, that was very hateful of you.
Every time somebody yells at me or takes some clothing and throws it to the ground, I ash a cigarette out in the face. That's just how I roll.
I also think
That's the most badass policy I've ever heard.
she also ruined or just totally minimized real sexual violence. Like we've handled rape cases, and as a prosecutor I handled them, and what happens in those cases and the real PTSD that's felt. And she says that if your partner gets angry with you or yells at you and intimidates you, that's sexual violence. And if they take it to a certain level where you don't feel like you have enough money to leave, that's sexual violence. Like by definition, that's not sexual violence. I knew they were going to try to turn this into, and I thought, again, I won't mention Aziz, but stuff like that, where you didn't want to have sex, but you didn't say you didn't want to have sex, and then later you felt like you were abused. Okay, if they went that line, and you go get into their head and say, she felt like she was being verbally abused, but she didn't even say that. She just said literally that if Johnny Depp gets mad at Amber Heard, and Amber Heard feels like she can't leave because she doesn't have enough money because she's a woman, that's sexual violence, or she can be a victim of sexual violence there and intimidation.
Well, there's two options I see on the table here. One, they're just running the sexual violence screen because of the headline in case they can't get it stricken. Two, we may get some really spicy testimony from Amber Heard with brand new allegations under that beautiful litigation privilege, where she gets to make claims that can be obscenely defamatory, but they're made under oath in court, and so they're protected from defamation. But that'll be. Oh, I almost hope it goes that route. If she just goes like, nope, I'm going nuclear, and I'm gonna accuse Johnny Depp of a bunch of sexual violence from the stand. Now that I know this thing's being there, that'll be, why have you never brought this up before? Is going to be the question.
We were promised that an opening, weren't we? We were told that's coming. I mean, they pretty much have to deliver now, or they've got a massive credibility problem.
Oh, that's going to be good.
They got the massive credibility problem, whether they deliver or not. That's already in the evidence.
Yeah.
This witness, I mean, again, she goes through her qualifications, which are 18 miles long. They're very impressive. It's okay, you're a great expert witness. And then you get up there, like, shouldn't you have gotten someone who maybe at least has some interest in talking about intimate partner violence versus men and dispelling the myth of violence? Like, that's who I would want. I would want someone who actually practices in that and saying, yeah, we actually didn't identify this as intimate partner violence against Johnny Depp. We identified this as reactive partner violence, that he was a perpetrator. And I'm a specialist in this type of thing, and I deal primarily with male clients. And in this case, I don't find it, something like that, but she's coming across so overtly biased.
They want somebody who at least looks like they can consider the question, whereas, she's coming off like she has one answer for whatever question you want to ask her, and it's always going to be the same thing. And I hope the jury's sitting there having the same reaction everybody I know is having, which is, ooh, like this is a bad witness.
Yeah. Well, we'll see as we go. I'm going to read a couple of these super chats, but if anybody has anything, feel free to step in and offer. Amazing Wireless 2 says, jury is back. That was a lie, you liar. Mark Gee, can I get a quick shout out to a coworker who is watching this in the data center's break room? Don't know who you are, but I see you watching this. What's up to that guy? Tom Brawl. Oh, shoot. It just skipped down on me 1 second. Where did we go?
Anybody have a guess at what she charges? I didn't hear it if she said it.
They haven't asked yet. I mean, they'll ask her on
Yeah.
They'll ask her on cross for sure.
What do you
Yeah.
think?
One string of pearls for every.
New York. I'm guessing 950.
Wow. You think it's that high? I
Yeah.
thought Dr. Mommy was going to be really expensive, and she was like $350 an hour or something like that. Or no, they didn't even ask her. I don't think.
I would guess 650.
I'm going to say
I'm gonna lowball it.
750.
I'm going to lowball it at $400 an hour.
I'm thinking 600. That's my guess. It seems to me she might be doing a lot of this at a discount just because I think she's a crusader. I don't think this is. I don't think she's a hired gun in the sense of I don't think she'd say anything you wanted her to just because
But
you're
you
the
know when
lawyer.
to pick her, you mean?
Yeah, she's somebody you go to when you have a particular thing because she's always crusading on this one issue. That's
Her opinions are consistent.
yeah. She never has
Her bad opinions, you mean, are consistent.
They
have
are
one
consistent.
and she's never felt the need for a second.
Look, there's usefulness in consistency. Tom Brawl, can I get a toast to my 3-year-old son, Robert Patton? He is blessing that later in life, every year I buy a bottle of bourbon for when he turns 21. Hey, that's a cool gift. I'm not liquoring because of the Pro-Vigil, but yes, Tom. Cheers to your son, 3 years old and so much life left to go, and a father who is planning for his future, evident in the gifts that he is giving. Cheers, buddy. Fadi LDD says that's 15 minutes establishing credibility already. Geez, enough. Joe Cooley, as a magician, I resent that comment on her jacket. Also, I'm close to being an affiliate on Twitch where I play Dead by Daylight and sometimes do magic. Joe, the GRE4T, so like great with a 4 instead of an A. Yeah, what do you think of Andrew? What do you think of Amber Heard's outfit today?
I can't say I have a real strong impression of her outfit. Is there something I was supposed to have noticed?
It's like a tuxedo jacket. I hate it.
I'll pay attention to it closer after the break. I mean, she's come off of the SS type costume, which I think has been to her advantage. But obviously, she has still been presenting a fairly masculine style. I think she thinks maybe it makes her look professional. But I don't know. Nothing has beat those brass buttons yet, in my opinion. That was just such a terrible suit. It did. It made her look like she sat down at the trial, after arriving from Dachau.
Gates of Above says, oh, so she helped all those doctors and nurses here in New York City with their TikTok dances and videos? Awesome. Fluffy Cakes Lives, does she have any connection with either Johnny or Amber? I mean, her connection with Amber is that Amber's team hired her to deliver this expert opinion. Mechanical Elizabeth, Dr. Karen is clearly biased in that only women can be victims, which to me means her professional opinion is flawed. Fadi LDD, oh, maybe they're trying to establish that any kind of antagonization that might be called abuse can be called violence, excusing her use of the word violence in the op-ed. Oh, yeah. That's definitely what they're trying to do.
Mumble.
And
is an example.
And the other thing, it's funny that one of the first questions for this expert witness was the weight differential between men and women generally, as if a 120-pound person hitting a 185-pound person isn't violence. Like as if that
classes, Nick. Okay.
Yeah.
That was her explanation.
And it is funny that she picks 120 and 185, just like because Johnny Depp isn't a big guy. So if she would have said 225, which would be much different than 185. If she would have said 225, everybody would have been like, "What?" But 185, yeah, that looks about like Johnny Depp's weight. I'm gonna guess. I'm gonna guess she's plus minus 5 pounds on each of those numbers.
I'm also going to guess she doesn't know jack about punching technique and the importance that hip rotation and other factors play in the ability to recruit force into your punch.
The other thing is she's speaking in the terms of this coercive control environment. The physical violence doesn't have to be physically devastating to implement coercive and control sort of ideas. A woman slapping a man. I remember this. One of my very, very good friends. We were at a wedding of our other friend, and at the reception, his girlfriend was mad at him because he went out with all of his friends to smoke a celebratory cigar. And so when he came back inside, she stood up in the middle of the reception, and we were, at one of the main tables, so right in the middle, and she slapped him across the face. Did this hurt him in any way? No. But it was like the most shameful look I've ever seen on his face. And he said, "Let's go home." And he left. She controlled the situation thoroughly with that one move that was not physically damaging in any way. And so to suggest that the weight differential matters. I mean, sure, if we're talking about catastrophic violence, but there's no evidence of that in this case. There is no evidence. Even if you go with maybe Johnny had struck Amber at some point in time, there is no evidence of a broken bone, of a severe contusion of some sort, any sort of like tangible effect of heavy violence. So the violence from either side is going well, except for that whole missing finger thing for Johnny. But the typical violence that's been talked about in this relationship from either side is more about the control, the shame, that sort of presentation. So again, trying to draw these parallels is pissing me off.
And she seems so willing to suggest, there's all these different ways that these abuse dynamics manifest depending on the gender, right? And so why not acknowledge how emasculating it is for a man to be struck by a woman?
Yeah. That'll be up to Cross. Joy May says abusers do not just start abusing one partner after having multiple prior partners that they never abused. Depp's attorneys need to ask the expert about this. Abusers normally abuse every partner in relationships. And maybe that's on the plan. Depp's team is just begging to kick the door open on her 2009 domestic abuse charge. They're begging to get that in some way.
I hope this is the opening.
Andrea, how'd you like Ben Chu on the dismissal argument? Going, I can't wait to argue against this.
We were all Ben Chu in that moment.
This is some bullshit. I'm ready to call that out. Oh, that was good.
By the way, a totally unrelated note, I noticed somebody in the chat was talking about this. I don't know if this has been discussed yet, but right at the beginning of the pandemic, Amber Heard was seen with girlfriend Ivanka Booty Buddy. I don't know. So she did swing the other way at some point. I don't know if we all knew about that.
Actually, did there was a time when you conducted a forensic?
She's back to being a lesbian.
Right now? Like today? As of today? Okay.
Please tell the jury what a forensic psychological evaluation is.
Could you turn it on at the bottom base?
A forensic psychological evaluation is an evaluation that is conducted for the courts to answer a particular legal question. It contains multiple parts. Ms. Heard is not a client of mine. She's never been in therapy with me. She's not under my clinical care. It is an objective evaluation to determine a particular legal question. Forensic evaluation follows a methodology that what we say is it's a multi-method, multi-hypothesis-driven methodology, which means I look at a variety of different documents and data, using multiple hypotheses. It's not just one hypothesis, one theory of the case. You're going and looking to see, what possibly could be going on here. And then you use the data to arrive at that opinion. You look for consistency across the data to arrive at that opinion. And the forensic psychological evaluation has many parts. It has the clinical interview part, a structured or semi-structured clinical interview where I'm asking Ms. Hurd lots of things about her life, both before Mr. Depp and after. It involves a psychological testing component of the evaluation, which allows me to do a good broad scan of different symptomatologies that people might have in their lives, as well as to have indicators of how she approached the test. Is she defensive? Is she malingering? Is she feigning? Is she exaggerating? It gives me indications about how she approached the evaluation. I review a number of documents, medical records, psychological records, the text, the audio, all the different things that we've had in this case, and then I conduct collateral interviews.
So, Dr. Hughes, just to be clear, do you assume everything the victim reports is true when you conduct these examinations?
No, of course not. I always approach a forensic evaluation with a healthy dose of skepticism. With any forensic evaluation, there exists a motivation that the individual may be telling you something that is not accurate. It doesn't mean that that's there, but you have to control for that and know that you're looking for, again, what does the data tell you, the external data, about what the person is also telling you.
Did the forensic evaluation follow a standard methodology, or was it specific to Ms. Hurd?
This was my standard methodology that I would use with any individual who's in a forensic matter, and I was called to evaluate them.
When did you meet with Amber Hurd?
Okay, so I met with Ms. Hurd for a total of about 29 hours. I met with her for the first time in September 2019. I saw her for 4 visits in live in my New York City office. That's about 21, 22 hours. And then I saw her twice over Zoom. One was in January 2021. And
Okay.
"29 hours is a lot of time for Amber to clarify what she needed to tell this doctor."
Yeah, and it's interesting because she's obviously not doing a CME, so she, subjected herself to this for the betterment of the case because it's not her treating psychologist. So she's meeting with her literally just to prepare her opinion for trial to combat what the CME doctor said. Basically what this is.
And I'm guessing her test for malingering is, well, I thought she might be making some stuff up, but then I remembered that she's the woman, so I decided against it.
In answering that question, were you consulting anything?
Dr. Hughes.
Dr. I'm so sorry.
She called her Dr. Curry.
I'm concerned with my cheat sheet of the dates that I saw Ms. Hurd so that I could accurately report to the court. I also have my final designation in front of me so that I could give the most accurate information to what I put in that form.
Okay. And do you want to? Okay. Should we just take the break now and have him look at it, or do you
Would you like to get now or before process?
It's just to post it.
Okay, before process.
Okay,
All right,
that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good lawyering. You're allowed to see it. If she carries it up there, she'll let us see it. Might as well.
Sure. So there are 4 dates in person.
Elaine's a little shook, I think, now.
For a total of about 21 and a half hours. And then I saw her in January 18th, 2021, over Zoom for 3 hours, and then December 27th, 2021, for 4 hours over Zoom.
And what did the evaluation consist of?
So as I stated, the evaluation consisted of psychological testing, a semi-structured clinical interview with Ms. Hurd, a review of a whole host of documents relative to this case and medical records and psychological records, and then 3 collateral interviews, 2 with her treating therapist, Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, and also with her mom.
And in the semi-structured clinical interview, what were you assessing?
Well, when someone comes in for the evaluation, you sometimes don't know what you're going to see or what you're going to get. So you absolutely have to do a full clinical interview and have a sense of their life patterns, things that have affected them in their lives, where they have worked, where they have lived, just get a full sense of their sort of being for the incident for which they're talking about. Then I do a full intimate partner violence assessment, looking at all those characteristics that I talked to you about earlier to get a sense of the full structure of and the dynamic of this relationship. I also did looking at what were the effects, what were the psychological consequences of being in that relationship. And I also looked at the psychological consequences of some of the statements that were made by Mr. Depp through his attorney that are part of this, the counterclaim in this lawsuit.
At the end of that process, considering all the data, did you arrive at any expert opinions?
Yes, I did.
All right. I'd like to start with your main expert opinions and then go through those. Can you please tell the jury what your main opinions were?
So like I said, there are opinions embedded within them, but the main opinion is that Ms. Heard's report of intimate partner violence and the records that I reviewed is consistent with what we know in the field about intimate partner violence, characterized by physical violence, psychological aggression, sexual violence, coercive control, and surveillance behaviors.
And what was the other main opinion that you had?
The second main opinion was that that Ms. Heard demonstrated very clear psychological and traumatic effects or the exacerbation of trauma from those statements that Mr. Depp made through his attorney. There were 3 statements that we evaluated to see how they affected her emotionally and psychologically. And it was my determination that they did.
And did you arrive at any diagnostic conclusions?
Yes, I did.
And what were those?
I diagnosed Ms. Heard with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And what, if any, etiology was associated with the post-traumatic stress disorder?
So the etiology is the cause. In order to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have an actual cause. It's one of the few diagnostic entities that we have to have a cause for. And the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. That was what was pushed. That was related to the intrusive phenomena, that was related to her avoidance, that was related to her differences in her mood, that was related to her avoidance efforts. So it was the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp.
Now, let's first go back to the forensic
Dr. Curry's coming back on rebuttal, y'all.
Documents. What documents did you review?
So I'm going to refer to my list of documents so that I can be clear for you all. It is a 4-page.
All right.
So now we have competing PTSD diagnoses. Dr. Curry said no PTSD and actually signs of feigning symptoms. We have this lady who's all in on the PTSD and specifically links it to the intimate partner violence of Johnny Depp. I'm curious which traumatic event or what traumatic series of events specifically would be linked to that intimate partner violence that leads to PTSD. I wonder.
Dr. Curry just made it extra spicy in this courtroom.
She was present when somebody got their finger knocked off.
Yeah. It was very traumatic seeing all the blood fountain like Vesuvius out of his finger. So yeah, that means that whenever we get to rebuttal, almost for sure, Dr. Curry's going to come back and roast this chick's diagnoses. Dan Goodwin says, Runkle, would love to see some of your leather work. My wife is an artist who designs leather tooling patterns and carves beautiful tooled leather bags. She sells her patterns and goods at KG Western Designs on Etsy. Cheers.
Well, I'm actually wearing a belt I tooled, so I don't know if you can see in here.
Oh, here, just a second. Let me. Nice. That's
cool. Oh, wow, that's cool.
And then it's got
the Kraken.
I love that we got Runkle to take his belt off.
It wasn't that hard, if I'm being honest.
No, not at all. A little bit more effort for on OnlyFans.
Normally it takes a couple of clicks, but
Adam says this expert witness keeps describing the violence Ms. Heard perpetrated against Johnny Depp in video and audio recordings. They probably should have put in some of their own evidence so that the jury didn't only have Johnny Depp's evidence in their memory to consider. I think they should have led with Whitney. I really do. I do not. I think the doctor going before Amber is ultimately probably a good move. I agree with Runkle when he said that. I think that was Runkle. But I really think they should have started with Whitney and maybe ended with Amber.
Give the jury some facts that the expert can take from Amber's point of view without it being Amber, and then she can apply those facts, as opposed to all we have is Johnny's witnesses explaining facts, and now we hear this doctor explaining this intimate partner violence, and we're all thinking Johnny's facts, and they didn't get Amber's facts in before this doctor. I agree with you 100%.
Dr. Curry.
By the way, if you guys like the stream, click like.
Dr. Curry, she did it again. She did it again. She shook.
Mommy's giving her the hot
Excuse. If you need to consult your notes to answer something, let us know that you need to consult your notes. Otherwise, try to answer to the best of your ability. And then if you need to do that, just let us
Weapon hopping.
consult your notes, okay? The concern is that you not read from them, that you consult them as you need to, okay?
Correct, I just don't want this to be a memory test of having conducted many documents, 80 pages of notes,
But you
12
can-
psychological testings to.
You can reference your notes, just don't read them, okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great.
Ben Chu is throwing his hands up looking at the jury. He's mad that she just had that
Okay,
conversation.
so I reviewed a number of documents, a plethora of documents, most, and I obviously won't read them all, but I reviewed certainly all of Ms. Heard's testimony that she gave, in her deposition testimony in this case, her deposition or her trial testimony in the UK case. I did the same thing for Mr. Depp. I reviewed his deposition testimony as well as his trial testimony in the UK as well. I reviewed a number of the depositions that were put forth in this case. I reviewed the psychological treatment notes for Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, Dr. Laurel Anderson, and Dr. Amy Banks, although she did not have treatment records. So I reviewed not only their records, did collateral interviews with some of them, and also read their deposition testimony, and also read other medical records in this case, nursing notes in this case, in the highlights. And I also listened to the audios that were put forth in this case, and read the text messages and emails.
And what, if anything, did you do with respect to any videos?
And I also saw the video in the kitchen, yes.
With respect to the videos, what did you do?
The
I watched them.
interviews that you conducted, why did you conduct those?
What if anything needed it
Well, collateral
immediately?
interviews is a standard part of a forensic evaluation. It's an opportunity to hear from another treating clinician, the person who's actually treating the individual you're evaluating, and get a better sense from that person of what they saw, what they knew, how they experienced this person. Sometimes our clinical notes don't give the full breadth of what really was going on in that therapy, because the notes are meant to be sort of short and to the point of what happened, who was there, and what was the plan. So it was really helpful to talk to these two clinicians who really were with Ms. Heard throughout the duration of her relationship with Mr. Depp. So they gave us sort of a
And who were required to take her word
look
for
at
what
what was
happened.
going on for her emotionally, and then what was she reporting, what was she
Sure, that's
saying
helpful.
about the relationship to her therapist.
And you mentioned the name Dr. Bonnie Jacobs. Please tell the jury who Dr. Bonnie Jacobs is.
So Dr. Bonnie Jacobs was Ms. Heard's therapist, and may I refresh my recollection with my notes, Your Honor?
She's allowed to
For the
consult the
dates,
notes.
if you'd like me to tell the dates.
She's asking me a question.
You're right, Your Honor. Yes.
May I?
Yes, you may.
Ben Chu did this by getting upset last time.
Objection, Your Honor.
She can't testify without consulting her notes at all? Like to anything? Like this isn't a specific question.
Yeah, she can just say, I met with them and or I looked at it and this is what I saw. She doesn't have to tell us it was exactly 2 hours and 23 minutes on April 14th. Like, she doesn't need to say that.
Wow.
Yeah, he's really pissed.
And usually you want the witness to at least try to answer the question, and then if they can't, then the jury can see that, and they go back to their notes.
Give me a
Well, the fact that they talked about referring to her notes before the cross makes it sound like there may be issues with production, which you would assume she has produced her report. She's required to produce her report. But if she's referring to notes they haven't seen, that would certainly make me upset.
It seemed like these notes were just dates, and it seemed like they actually weren't that important because they didn't even care to take a break and look at them during her testimony. So normally I would agree with you, but I would think, wouldn't you think at that point they would say, let's stop everything, give me a copy of those notes so I can look at them and have a second to prepare. I would think if it was something about production, but I don't know.
So
I gotta get going, guys. Thanks for having me.
From October 2011 through August 2014. She actually was seeing Dr. Jacobs somewhat earlier before she got in a relationship with Mr. Depp. And then she transferred care to Dr. Connell Cohen, who was referred by Dr. Kipper, who was the treating physician for Mr. Depp, and then later for Ms. Heard. And she treated with Dr. Cohen from after she left Dr. Bonnie Jacobs in September 2014 to June 7, 2016.
Okay, thank you. And so you, and I guess you got ahead of me there, so you also talked to Dr. Cohen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you also spoke with Paige Heard, did you say?
That's correct.
And who is Paige Heard?
Paige Heard is Amber Heard's mother.
And when did you speak with Paige Heard?
I spoke with all of these individuals at the end of 2019. Again, I can check my notes and let you know the exact date if you'd like.
At the end of 19?
Yeah, they all were in the end of 19.
All right. And are you aware that Paige Heard has since died? She died 2 years ago?
Yes, I am aware, sadly.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the psychological testing. You stated that you conducted psychological testing, is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you please tell the jury how many psychological assessments you administered to Amber Heard?
I administered 12.
Can you please tell the jury which ones you administered?
So I am going to refer to my designation that has the list so that I don't forget anything.
Okay.
So I administered.
Objection to hearsay, Your Honor.
She can refresh her recollection.
As long as she's not reading it.
Right, you just can't read. You're not supposed to read from it, but you can refresh your recollection as you're speaking.
So I can look and just look up, and that's refreshing my recollection.
Didn't she see, is she not the one that testified in 100 trials?
Oh, look at her. Now she's just like taking her head towards the jury.
Oh, Dr. Nark has come to testify.
Oh, she looks.
But yeah, she just wants to like read her report. There's a reason the report can't come into evidence. You can't just sit up there and read it. You have to actually prepare and testify.
I bet she's never a day in her life without speaking to somewhere's manager.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
My God, the smirk. It really is. This is becoming clear.
Funny thing is, so if I'm not mistaken, I've heard that the majority of the jury panel is male. And if you're going to sit there and testify that men are the perpetrators of domestic violence and then act tyranny when things don't go perfect for you, you're losing the men on the jury really quickly, I would suspect. Because you've just insulted all of them, even though you maybe didn't try to.
Yes, I can. I administered the personality assessment inventory, which is a broadband instrument to scan for psychopathology and psychological symptoms that people have. I administered the trauma symptom inventory too, which is an instrument to scan for common traumatic effects that people have. I administered the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms Test, which is a measure of malingering. I administered the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist for the 5th edition for the DSM-5. I administered the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5. I administered the Beck Depression Inventory, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, the Mood Disorders Questionnaire, the Danger, I did 3 intimate partner violence measures, the Conflict Tactics Scale, the Abusive Behavior Observation Checklist, and the Danger Assessment Scale. And then I also did the Life Events Checklist, which scans and gets us to ask about a lot of traumatic events that an individual may have experienced, and we administer that typically before either doing the PCL or doing the CAPS.
Thank you. Were there any tests you administered to Amber Heard that were designed to reveal malingering or feigning?
Yes, there were.
Okay, can you please tell the jury about those?
So malingering is the false production of psychological symptomatology for the purpose of some external material gain. Feigning is the false production of psychological symptomatology with no identification of what that gain may be. So basically feigning is saying your mental health is worse than it actually is. So I administered 3 of the tests had validity indices built in that could allow us to address that question. The MFAS, the Miller Assessment of Forensic Assessment of Symptoms Test, is a specific malingering instrument. It looks at malingering psychopathology. Is this someone, malingering psychopathology? She scored a 0 on that scale. So on that test, sorry, not the scale, that test. So on that test, there was no evidence of malingering. On the TSI, there are 2 validity indices, and she scored within the normal range on those scores as well. One was slightly elevated, but when in testing the limits, because it has rare symptoms and over-endorsed symptoms, I determined that also was a valid measure. And then finally, the PAI, the large scale 344 question instrument, has very robust validity scales on it to test for exaggeration or feigning or malingering, and she did not score in any of those scores in those scales at all. Those were not elevated. So the combined results between those 3 tests suggest to me that Ms. Heard is not malingering for psychological symptomatology.
Now, Dr. Curry testified the one test showed, quote, intentional exaggeration in the 98th percentile, meaning that she engaged in extreme levels of exaggeration, end of quote. Do you agree with that?
I do not.
Why?
Because that test, the scale that she is referring to is it's called ATR, it's the atypical response scale. As I said, that combines rare symptoms and over-endorsed symptoms. It's very frequently elevated in people who have high levels of distress. And then importantly, on this test specifically, it says, do not use the percentile rank. It is in the manual, it is in italics, because the way that this test was normed, it was normed on people who have trauma. So it's what we call negatively skewed. That means it falls on the tail end of the continuum. It is not a normal curve where we would normally think of how a percentile would work. So you would not use the percentile rank on this test.
You want to approach? Okay.
Judge, all the objections. Mutters under her breath. Dr. Curry is seething.
Or was that not a very effective explanation for a jury talking about the tail of the curve?
Yeah. Well, it says in the manual. It says in the manual.
I mean,
What in the manual? Like,
she's quite possibly correct, but she could have explained that a lot better.
I feel like Dr. Curry might have a response on the rebuttal.
So that is a very inaccurate way to describe that scale and that test. And so the ATR scale on this test is probably the least robust of our validity scales, so you would never make a comment like that based on one scale if you don't have consistency across data. And when you look at the consistency across the testing with the PAI, the TSI, and the MFAS, and there's research to support that, that when they go together, you have a higher degree of likelihood that this is not feigned PTSD, that this is not feigned symptomatology. And then actually, if I look at the validity scores on the MMPI-2 that Dr. Curry administered, those scales are not elevated for exaggeration or malingering either. So if I add that, now I have really robust data that Ms. Hurd is not malingering or feigning her psychological symptomatology.
Thank you. Did you administer any tests that are specific to domestic violence?
Yes, I did.
Which ones?
So that was the conflict tactic scale, the abusive behavior observation checklist, and the danger assessment scale.
And what did they show?
Would like to refer to the testing.
To refresh
To
your
refresh my
recollection?
recollection, just at a glance, so I
Yes,
can
you
be
do.
clear with the jury. So what the
Johnny Depp just giving her sultry
overall
eyes.
gist of the testing was that, and the benefit of these tests is that they allow me to ask for what Mr. Depp did to Ms. Hurd, and then also what Ms. Hurd did to Mr. Depp. So it was asking about both sets of behavior. And what-
Objection, Your Honor. We're back reading.
She wasn't even looking down. She was looking at the.
She's got the paper up.
Go ahead.
Please continue.
So
This is good.
what these
Keep doing
tests
it.
show was that there was a high degree of serious violence perpetrated by Mr. Depp toward Ms. Hurd. There was violence more on the mild level perpetrated by Ms. Hurd toward Mr. Depp, with one severe indicator, which was the punching that she indicated to me.
Finger.
There were scales about negotiation, about how much this couple tries to figure out their problems. They both scored, again, this is Ms. Hurd reporting that, but they both scored in the high range, where they're both saying that, yes, we're trying to figure this out, we're trying to work out this relationship. There were scores on the psychological aggression scale, where Mr. Depp engaged in more severe acts of psychological aggression, whereas Ms. Hurd did engage in also some mild and severe acts of psychological aggression. The amount of injury that was reported was significantly higher and more severe by Ms. Hurd, what she was subjected to, and then she was subjected to sexual violence, where Mr. Depp, based on her report, was subjected to none. And then the other, on the danger assessment scale, that there were a number of factors that were related to severity in violent relationships, and a risk factor. When we look, as I said earlier, when behaviors come up on the scale, they're very worrisome, very scary, and we have to take them seriously. So there were a number of behaviors that came up on the scale, such as Mr. Depp threatens to kill her, the increase in severity of the abuse, the forced sexual activity, the choking behavior, his obsessive jealousy.
Objection, Foundation.
Talking about the test results. Please continue.
The obsessive jealousy, the control aspect, and his threatening of suicide, to kill himself. So those were risk factors that placed her in the increased danger range. And this is a range that, says that we certainly have to advise women of their risk and consult with law enforcement if they're involved, or judges if they're involved, because this means that a woman is at risk for more serious or lethal domestic violence.
So the psychological test you administered to Amber Heard support a diagnosis of PTSD.
Objection, leading.
What, if any, psychological tests did you administer that supported a diagnosis of PTSD for Amber Heard?
Sure. So there were 4 tests that supported that diagnosis. One was the PAI, which was that 344 question large scale personality inventory. On that test, her largest subscale, her highest subscale was the one that measures traumatic stress. So that was clinically significant. On the TSI, two of her scales were the intrusive experiences dimension and the defensive avoidance dimension, two of the classic scales of trauma and PTSD. On the PCL, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist 5, that she scored in all 4 domains of PTSD, and that's an instrument that says how much are you bothered by these symptoms. And in all 4 clusters, which would be the intrusive experiencing, when things about the abuse or the trauma enter your mind when you did not want them to. Sometimes they're cued, sometimes they're uncued. She answered in the avoidance category, which is the second category of PTSD, that I do things to try not to think about this, to try not to feel this, to try not to get upset. Sometimes I avoid certain people because they become a trigger for me. She scored in the what we call the negative alterations in cognition and mood, changes in her thoughts and feelings as a result of the abuse and trauma, and also in the physiological hyperactivity, the hyperarousal, the hypervigilance, the startle response. So on the PCL, she endorsed symptoms in all 4 of those categories, saying, some of these symptoms are bothering me a lot. And then finally, the clinician administered PTSD scale for the DSM-5. And what that allows me to do, unlike the PCL, is really look at symptom severity and symptom frequency. How is this really playing out for this individual? And similarly, she scored in all 4 categories of trauma and of having intrusive experiences and nightmares and avoidance efforts and physiological hyperactivity and changes in her mood and her thoughts. And her total score was a 28, which falls in the moderate range. So that means that she has experienced a moderate degree of post-traumatic stress disorder symptomatology. And those tests allow me to make that definitive diagnosis that she suffers from PTSD.
Thank you. What, if any, consideration did you give to Amber Heard's history of childhood abuse in making your diagnosis?
I mean, that was a significant consideration, given that we know that childhood, well, first of all, we know that people can experience multiple traumas across the lifespan. And we wanted to make sure that the symptoms that she was experiencing were related to what she experienced with Mr. Depp and not her childhood. And certainly, earlier on in the evaluation and when I evaluated and spoke with her, that was true. And that was also true on the latest measure, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5, the CAS-5. And that's because the content, you have to look at what is the content of the symptom. So it's not that someone says, oh yeah, something traumatic comes into my mind. No, what is it? What comes into your mind? What bothers you? What are the triggers? And those were all specific to Ms. Heard's relationship with Mr. Depp. The reason the childhood is also significant is that we know that if somebody suffers childhood abuse as a child, they are much more likely to have an adult re-victimization. And they're much more likely then to be more vulnerable to obtaining a PTSD, to getting PTSD, if they've had that prior vulnerability. So it's a very strong vulnerability characteristic to obtaining PTSD when you have a subsequent trauma. The other aspect about her childhood abuse is that she was raised in a family of violence. She was physically abused by her father. She saw her father abuse her mother. Her father was very explosive and had violent outbursts. And both her parents also struggled with substance abuse very significantly. So she had learned from a very early age how to caretake, how to live in a situation that is mired in chaos. How do I take care of a parent who's passed out, knotted out from heroin? And how do I get up and get my sister to school? She learned at a very early age that she had to figure out how to do this in this scenario. And I would say lastly, what that environment taught her was that she learned that she could love someone who hurts her. She knew that people who hurt her also can love her. And she learned how to have this tolerance for cognitive inconsistency, this tolerance for two should be diametrically opposed emotions. but she grew up knowing or believing perhaps that this could happen. And she also believed that she could fix him, just like she tried to fix her father, and just like she tried to fix her mother. She truly, truly believed that she could fix Mr. Depp and rid him of his substance abuse problems. But that did not work.
She's just
Camera was ready.
Caps 5 that she administered.
There it is.
Yes, I did.
And what, if any, agreement did you have with Dr. Curry's interpretation of CAPS 5?
I didn't agree with her interpretation, having been a trauma psychologist for over 25 years and administered hundreds of these. I found that there were flaws in how she chose to administer it, and then some of the coding misheard on that CAPS 5 to Dr. Curry certainly reported trauma-based symptomatology related to the abuse by Mr. Depp, but somehow that was not coded as such.
And did you review Dr. Curry's MMPI too that she administered on Amber Heard?
Yes, I did.
And do you agree with her interpretations on that test?
No, I do not.
Why not?
Because this profile is a normal profile. It is, there are no clinical scores elevated above 65, which is 1.5 standard deviations of the mean, which is what we use to determine clinical significance. And if none of those scales are elevated, it becomes very difficult for us to make assumptions about a person's psychology and their functioning. Now remember, the psychological testing generates hypotheses about a person that we then, using our clinical judgment, have to make a decision about. We have to make an assessment about it. And if none of those scales are elevated, it just doesn't give us rich information to make those determinations. The one scale which is accurate that was elevated was one that measures defensive responding, sort of a protective responding, an unwillingness to admit minor faults. That was elevated, and that was true. But the result of that is you have a defensive profile. You have somebody who's not giving you a lot of information. So the scales are all low. So there's no way you can take that MMPI and then say it meets it's consistent with borderline personality disorder. You just don't have the symptom expression on it in order to do that.
And that's my next question here. What, if any, diagnoses did you make of personality disorders for Amber?
None. She's perfectly normal.
I did not make a personality disorder of Ms. Heard.
Why not?
Then what would the
For a
point?
number of reasons. Number one, a personality disorder requires a pervasive pattern in a variety of contexts.
So why are you talking about Amber Heard then? If you
Variety of contexts. That means if her emotional instability, her affective dysregulation, or her fear of abandonment is only in the relationship with Mr. Depp, and we don't have evidence of it before, and we don't have evidence of it after.
So you're saying if she beats multiple partners, that would count?
And are they opening the door to prior abuse?
They're getting there. They're getting close.
I should think so based on that.
I'd ask the judge about it right before cross. Your Honor.
Took the whole dinger.
Yeah, you don't want to binger this one up.
She's just basically testifying that outside of her relationship with Johnny Depp, there's no instability that's there. But Your Honor, we can show instability and violence. Is that wait? They must have.
I think that's what's happening right now.
That's what I'd be doing.
Me too.
Man, this is. Let's see. Here we go. Let me read some of these. David A. Hamilton, why can they not object to this doctor only referring to the victim as female and the perpetrator as male? No, let her do that. It's obvious. Let them do it. Like the jury isn't dumb. I mean, they might be, but the same as everybody else. It's just a group of people. So as many of them as are likely to be dumb are just as likely to be smart. So they're sitting there listening to the same thing. Zadok attack. I didn't know Johnny identified as a woman and Amber identified as a man. Weird. Xiomara, I knew this expert was a raging, insert words I can't use. Her language is completely gendered and oriented towards women, beyond bias, as well. How is this person allowed to practice? Well, she's got her licensure, and that's that's what you need to practice most things. No one ever. The license doesn't guarantee you'll be good at anything. Hence why I'm on YouTube. Joe Everyman. Joe Everyman says, of course, men can be abused too. Anyway, men are never really abused, and it's always worse for women. So, just believe me and not your lying eyes. Doug Murray, rackets. Why in the wide world of sports does Amber Heard's defense team let her dress up like the background singers in Robert Palmer's Addicted to Love video? That being said, she is very handsome. Brandon Lesko. What blows my ducking mind is that nobody calls out Stahl's 5th edition prescriber's guide inciting the DSM-5. Modafinil is on page 453, Nick. Remember to share the wealth. Please explain digital penetration in Richard's FML. Well, you see, members of the jury, digital penetration, you might think has something to do with that virtual reality stuff that's going around right now. My kid's got an Oculus, he plays Beat Saber. That has nothing to do with digital penetration. We're actually talking about using fingers as an appendage to stimulate sexual organs internally. I hope that helps. Next, carbon-based. Why is she speaking directly to the jury and turning towards them? Seems like a manipulation technique. Talk in generalities without implicating Johnny directly. Well, that's she's an expert witness, so she's supposed to kind of do that. Also, Runkle, fix your audio. The earbuds aren't working. But the turning to the jury is because she's testified in a whole bunch of courtrooms and she finds it effective, is my guess. It's personable. Lots of people do that. You'll see it with police a lot.
I tell you want to testify to the jury or the judge, whoever's making the decision. Just you don't want it to be quite as obvious as one guy in Rittenhouse or one person in Rittenhouse was always.
Yeah. Everything was this number every 2 seconds. But yeah, naturally turning towards and addressing the person who is supposed to be hearing your testimony is kind of a normal thing. But yeah, if you're just answering yes, no, and you're like yes, that's weird. That's weird. But when you've got a longer explanation, you turn. You maybe use some hand gestures and you communicate with them. That's fine. Charles Hammer, what part does defecating in your husband's bed and mocking him after his finger is severed play? Sarah Kirk, one thought I had was that she was prepping the jury for what Amber Heard's demeanor may be on the stand. Example that she might be very uncomfortable talking about the abuse and show that by being friendly and happy. Ray Marshall, that witness lost credibility once she said she worked for the VA. Being medically retired, I have dealt with them enough to know just say or do whatever they can to advance to diagnose or help. David Keyes, psychologist, men are less likely to be murdered. Amber thinking, but more likely to lose a finger. Wolfram, if the majority of the jury is
psychologist for both Johnny and Amber.
Users by default. If you heard it, they heard it. Fubar again, what if anything happens in this court when a lawyer says, what if anything in front of this judge? I just hate that she has that has become the catchphrase to get past the leading question. To what degree, if any, did you? To me, that's more leading than just did you.
The judge blew that though from the jump. Like anything that starts with did is leading.
And
the judge just kind of blown that.
Doctor gave a statement out saying that Amber Heard has PTSD.
You could just frankly lead on cross. Because now both sides have done it. And she defended. That was my favorite. Elaine says, but I said, what if anything?
Literally. That's what she said. That was her argument in response to the objection.
It's not leading because I said, what if anything? Oh my God. Paul Wolf, you can say it was mutual. But when Johnny left, he tapped out of the fight. It was Amber that chose a slander route for a mutually bad relationship for her profit and sympathy because of her lost control. This guy is he's up there. He's animated.
He kind of seems like their expert direct and cross lawyer. Seems like he's done a lot of their experts.
Yeah, I can't remember.
I believe he's the one that I thought they brought in for Curry specifically.
He came in late with his appearance, but he's like the partner, lead, litigation group guy for Brown Rudnick, so he's probably just one of the top litigators at the firm.
Man, I'm just wondering if they're going in on this prior abuse. If they can get that prior act from 2009, it shatters the case.
Well, and they've deposed Tasia, they've deposed Bianca. So yeah, if there are other incidents of IPV that came out in those depositions, this could be bad for Amber.
Yep.
Oh, this could be
Yeah, I know.
the end of it.
First question: if someone engaged in domestic abuse in 2009, or did Miss Heard disclose domestic abuse in any prior relationships from either source, her or the other person?
Or use her own words against her. You said you have to have prior abuse, and you said you have to have a, whatever she said, a pattern of it. Can you explain what a pattern would mean? Did that mean in a prior relationship somebody accused you of abuse? Did that happen with Miss Heard? Oh, it didn't. Well, what about in 2009 and impeach her with the judgment and sentence or whatever it is? I don't even know what it is because I haven't followed whatever happened prior to this case. I've just heard inklings of there's prior abuse. I've tried to kind of wash my mind as much as possible to be as much of a juror as I could, but I've heard about the prior abuse, and I would love it if they were able to impeach her because I do think it comes into play with exactly the diagnosis this doctor is trying to put on Amber Heard.
Yep. The question would be, did Amber Heard disclose it to her?
That's true, yeah.
If you can get that in, that it was there and it was undisclosed, then you shred her testimony without actually going to the expert's credibility. Because
the other piece of this too is her prior abuse of Whitney, and that was something that we knew about from Jennifer Howell's statement.
He's smiling. I don't know if it's a good smile.
Oh man, I hope this would be entertaining as hell.
Dr. Hughes, what if anything did Dr. Cowan say to you about any type of diagnoses of personality disorders?
Dr. Cohen did not diagnose Ms. Heard with any personality disorder.
Muffin Lady.
Anything did Dr. Jacobs say diagnosing Amber Heard with any personality disorders?
And Dr. Jacobs similarly did not diagnose Ms. Heard with any personality disorder.
Thank you. Now, let's turn back to intimate partner violence. What types of physical violence were reported to you?
So there were a number of physically violent behaviors that were reported, that Ms. Heard reported that Mr. Depp perpetrated.
It's not hearsay, it's within her expert materials.
Her with the front of his hand and the back of his hand. He choked her, he slammed her into the wall, he pushed her and she fell down. He kicked her in the back. Again, without looking at my notes, that's what I can recall.
And what type of injuries did Amber Heard report to you?
She reported mostly bruising, pain, some cuts. She reported vaginal pain from some of the sexual assaults. She reported that she did have scratches and cuts on her from broken glass. She reported that she believed she may have lost consciousness 2 times, once in the Australia incident and once in the
why did she not get admitted at the hospital? Why did you not take a rib cut?
Control was reported, or did you find?
Leading.
Yeah. You think?
What if any coercive control was reported to you?
So the course of control that was determined in this relationship I found to be quite significant. There were many instances where Mr. Depp tried to control how Ms. Heard went about her career. He didn't want her to show nudity. He didn't want her to show boob. He didn't want her to act with certain actors because of this obsessive jealousy. He criticized her ambition. He'd rather she not work. He called, the ambition as something as a negative thing. It made her very fearful to have to look at scripts or talk about scripts or talk about movie roles because he persistently put those down and told her she didn't need to work and she didn't need to do that and she didn't need to show her tits and ass. He didn't
So that's abusive? That's abusive for a husband to do that?
She appeared in her fucking soft porn movie.
That she had to work with, males and females. So no matter what show she was filming or shooting, he would call the leading actor, he would call the director, he would tell you, I got eyes down there, I got eyes down on the set. So she never felt safe to be herself and be an
Hearsay within hearsay within hearsay.
for productions, because she'd have to come home and then endure his anger.
You have to
doing
back up.
something or for not doing something. When she was filming and he was in the same town, she feared that he would show up on the set and, to know what her call sheet, what she was filming that day. She, even told her assistant, don't give it to him, don't let him see it so that he won't show up. And sometimes he did. So it was very trepidatious for her and very anxiety provoking that he continued.
I'm looking forward to Johnny's lawyer to jump in though.
He tried to control what she wore. When she was going out with him, things were fine, but he told her often, no woman like mine is going to dress like a whore, and didn't want her to wear revealing clothing, or revealing clothing according to him. She recalled an incident when she was going on a job.
She should wear some revealing clothing to protest.
You're going to go out with a mask. And she had to sort of go in and put on what she said mom jeans so that she didn't look sexy, so she didn't look revealing, and continued to try to plead with him about
No, not yet.
jobs she could take and she
That's
could
still Crazy Cat later.
This made her be very sort of restrictive and try to conceal things. She would hide her scripts because she couldn't read them in front of him because he would.
The internet sleuths have a massive dossier of Amber's red carpet outfits with Johnny Depp, many of which are
Almost every person that she was in a film with, there would be those barrages of the consistent accusations of infidelity. And we saw that on the Australia pictures, the Billy Bob. He was one person that he continued, to.
We all die before we get the cross-examination.
When you look at how he wanted her to there was some interference with the family, with her sister, when something.
The video got leaked and his sister got beat by Amber.
You did it, and eventually Miss Heard had to
The vaginal bruising is something that I hope is not just like glossed over on cross for Johnny Depp's lawyers.
Constant barrage of criticism. So there were many instances when, in terms of their interactions, she would have to text him right back, but when she would text him, he could not answer for days. And it's this sort of, we talk about,
Have you considered that he was cool,
But
though?
your husband doesn't ghost you, your partner doesn't ghost you. And there were so many times of this sort of withdrawal of affection, which was on his terms and when he wanted to do it. I'm aware that there is, testimony in this.
Did you ask her if she was a victim of
decided
intimate
to
partner
leave
violence?
because he didn't want to be violent. And I do think that's true sometimes. I think he did leave in times where he didn't want an altercation. He did leave after an altercation. He did leave and then came back and continued the altercation. So leaving wasn't the defining variable. The problem was that, with this obsessiveness and this perseveration that he had, the fight would always come back. So leaving might end the argument for that moment, but Miss Heard knew he was always going to come back, and he was going to, start the interrogation once again.
Yeah, that was the concern she expressed in the audio tape.
I mean, the effect was drastic. She talked to me that she, her roles consistently dropped over the time that she was in the relationship with Mr. Depp, just because it was so difficult to go on auditions, to want to be in a different location with him. Whenever she was not on location,
That is easily debunked.
It's very stressful. It's very
She got
anxiety-provoking.
the most work she ever had during her relationship with Johnny.
We heard that through Isaac Ruth's testimony when she called and was saying, "Babe, there's no one here. There's no one here."
Yep, that's
That
true.
was something that she had to do repeatedly and constantly over the course of the relationship. So
Was there someone there?
an amount of anxiety, of distress, of having to try to conceal and maneuver around him to try to.
She is literally testifying for Amber. I just saw somebody say, that's what I've been thinking, is this is them just getting the first time hearing Amber testify.
Getting worse.
What about sexual violence?
So there was
This
a
is
number of
like
incidents of
Amber's
sexual violence
side of the story
reported,
now.
in this relationship.
Here we go.
Those
Like I'm out.
are documented early on in Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes, where when Mr. Depp was drunk or high, he threw her on the bed, ripped off her nightgown, and tried to have sex with her. There were times when he forced her to give him oral sex when he was angry. These weren't in loving moments. These were angry moments, moments of dominance, moments of him trying to get control over her. There was a time when they were in Hicksville in the
Sound like her fantasies, if you're asking me.
But I guess it's trailer park. It is a trailer park. Where
You
he
can say
was
that.
accusing her of a woman hitting on Amber, and that was the problem. Amber got accused of women hitting on her, and got accused of men hitting on her. So there were so many targets that
Women and men probably
came through
were
in
hitting
his
on her.
excessive jealousy. But when he, on that incident when Kelly Sue was accused of hitting on Miss Heard, and they went back into the trailer, Mr. Depp performed a cavity search and ostensibly was looking for drugs and felt it acceptable to rip off her nightgown and stick his fingers up her vagina to look for cocaine. Felt that maybe
No, that's hilarious because even the UK court did not find that happened.
Drug-fueled rage. There was another incident in the Bahamas where when he got angry,
We all know he was doing that while saying,
"Where's
"Where's the rum?"
Moved her around violently in the closet. Again, an act of sexual violence. And of course, the incident in Australia.
Vic was absolutely right about
Here
the
in
slew of
Australia
additional
that,
defamatory stories coming out.
In which when he was
This is wild. For somebody who doesn't know about this case, all this sexual violence now coming out.
I hate you, I'm gonna fucking kill you. And
Forget about the
grabbed
simple
bottle that
defense.
was on the bar and penetrated her with that bottle. And Miss Heard.
Oh, that's the story from
dissociating
Gone Girl, right?
and going outside
The
of her
bottle story?
body, and the only thing
It was from
remaining
opening.
is, oh God, I hope it's not the broken one.
What if any psychological abuse did you find?
There was a number of psychologically abusive behaviors. As I stated, Miss Heard admitted to me and reported that she engaged in those behaviors as well. She reported that she
I don't know what's
did
going
call
on.
him
There's two of
names
you.
and offensive comments.
The other one, my
My
system crashed. His laptop is dying.
Incredibly saddened and horrified by her behavior, and looking back, she, at this point, not being in the constant barrage of abuse, does not recognize her. The abuse by Mr. Depp, he called her a number of names, frequently whore, slut, cunt, lesbian camp counselor, easy, ambition. Ambition was a weaponized term in that relationship. So he called her a lot of names and humiliated her. And of course, I think we talked about the intimidation tactics that, Mr. Depp was often banging and throwing and hitting things in the household, which sort of got the tension to rise up very significantly, very quickly.
Can you tell me how you conducted your analysis to arrive at these conclusions?
Sure. So what I did was look at the incidents that were reported and look at the corroborating data around it. So as we stated, most of these incidents of intimate partner violence happen behind closed doors. Not everyone is going to witness what the parties are reporting behind closed doors. So you look at what is the data that surrounds it. Is there any data before it? Is there any data after it? Is the person telling? Is the victim telling somebody in real time about what's happening? Are there therapy notes? Are there pictures? Are there text messages?
She's relying on Amber corroborated herself.
Pieces of the
Yep.
picture, even though we don't have exactly
That'd be the
what
therapy
happened at
notes.
that moment. The more collateral that we have and the consistency across those data points, it gives us greater confidence in our results.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So
Vague.
for example, the Boston plane incident, I think without looking, May 24th, 2014. This is the incident where Ms. Heard and Mr. Depp were going to fly back to LA and spend the weekend together. They were shooting at different sites.
So the one with
Ms. Heard
multiple
was
eyewitnesses
waiting for Mr.
said
Depp
nothing.
to
That don't corroborate.
Tarmac. He's reportedly sitting on in
The one that they talk about on audio.
drinking, smoking weed and drinking. She is filming with James Franco at this point, and she gets on the plane and he starts talking about James Franco, making a lot of derogatory comments about her, and I hope you had fun with your escapades, and some more inflammatory language. And then
That's inflammatory?
an argument when she got up to leave, he kicked her in the back, and she went forward on the plane, to the front of the plane, because he sat in the back of the plane. So if I look at what is the corresponding data to this, there's a therapy note, several notes in Bonnie Jacobs records that talk about Mr. Depp's increasing use of alcohol and his obsessive jealousy around James Franco.
How is that a corroborating note?
After the incident, Ms. Heard told her friend Io, she told her friend Savannah, she told her friend Rocky. Ms. Heard did not go home. She was afraid to go home. So she went to a hotel because when
She partied at the Chateau Marmont.
to show up because he's still in that drinking and drugging phase. And he talked about that. That was the roxicodone before he detoxed. He was still in that, high substance abuse phase, that he would often show up at night, and that did not feel safe. There was a text from Stephen Duders, Mr. Depp's assistant.
Objection hearsay.
They're allowed to use hearsay, but it still has to be reliable on what they're trying to testify for, right? She can't just read every text in Amber's phone aloud for the jury to hear for every single person that, may have said something negative about Johnny. There are still things that are inadmissible even for an expert to testify to, and I think that's what they're getting annoyed about at this point, is she's just basically, she just said, as corroborating evidence, Amber told Io and Whitney and Rocky, but it's still just Amber telling all of them. So I don't understand why that's like addition. She's acting like that's 5 people who know now because Amber told all 5 of those people.
And a text from Stephen Duders that has not been admitted is being used here as evidence. He's not on a witness list, or he might have been on the witness list, but they didn't call him, so he's a rebuttal witness potentially. But
so I believe Amber has listed all of Johnny's witnesses on his witness list as a line item in her witness list. So, technically he could be a witness considered on her witness list, but
okay.
That's always a catch-all we do, and all witnesses listed on plaintiff's witness list or defendant's witness list. Did you notice in the argument mid-trial how they agreed and stipulated that they weren't going to call Amber during their case in chief? It was interesting.
Yeah, I caught that. Everyone's getting out their evidence books now.
Exactly. So they basically were saying, like, if you guys aren't going to call her, we're calling her. So you guys better call her, or else we're going to call her, which I think is an interesting tactic.
And if that was a stipulation, it was very odd for him in his their arguments about the directed verdict, or to say, well, they could have called her. It's like, except you agreed that wasn't going to happen.
I agree. I thought the same thing.
Yeah, and they have to call her now, because if they don't, and they just let Johnny call her in rebuttal to get in that text, he's going to very much limit the scope of what he asks her, and not open the door for her to, relate her entire fantasy story here. She's got to get on the stand now if she wants to get this out, first person.
This is amazing, though, because they're utilizing this doctor to testify for everybody, to testify for her treating physician or clinician or whatever, to testify for right now Io and Rocky, to testify for Stephen Duders, who would be an adverse witness normally. Like, they're utilizing Amber Heard or this lady as an expert reviewing these materials to get in whatever they want. I mean, she just testified about a whole slew of sexual violence, and she can't be cross-examined on any of it.
And normally they would expect the judge to shut that down, or at least would hear.
I believe, I have to double check, but I believe that there is a limiting instruction that the jury gets when the evidence is entered. You know, it's for a limited purpose. It's because it's the basis of the expert's opinion. And so they can't consider it for substantive evidence. Now, we can obviously debate about, you know, how much the jury would take that seriously and rigorously apply that. But at least from a technical standpoint, I do believe they are going to be told, look, this is only for purposes of evaluating what this doctor had to say. You can't consider it as proof of whether any of those allegations actually took place.
There's the Court TV chick.
Well, and hopefully they get the also the instruction of, to the extent that you find the facts are different than what the expert relied on, the expert's testimony might be given more weight, or it might be complete horseshit. Because she's relying on a lot of things that I don't think the jury's going to agree with.
It's just amazing how much she gets to just test it. Like, I know there's a limit.
Usually it wouldn't go this far.
This is a bit much.
So, Dr. Hughes, let's go past that text and talk about, go past that text and continue after that text.
Sure. So there was, Mr. Depp apologized to Ms. Heard for that incident. Mr. Depp said in his UK testimony, well, I only maybe playfully tapped her on the back with my foot. Mr. Depp texted Paul Bettany and talked about how he was so drunk and out of control and engaged in bad behavior. He texted his friend Patty Smith a very similar type of text about how drunk and out of control he was. And then finally, Amber Heard wrote an email.
She wrote an email
talking about how distressed and heartbroken she was.
Objection, hearsay.
I mean, I don't agree.
I know you don't. Nailed it.
So this is scary that they haven't been objecting the whole time now, and the judge is
So
saying.
all I can remember at this point.
Okay. What if any, sorry, I'm gonna have to go a little bit further here. So, you concluded that Amber Heard used psychological abuse and some reactive physical violence, I think I heard you say, is that correct?
Objection, leading.
Overruled. Can you please explain to the jury what you meant by that?
Yes, that is correct.
Frick
That,
you, right?
You know, Amber Heard reported to me some of the behaviors that she used that were psychologically aggressive.
Flopping?
The name
Did you
calling,
floppy
putting
fish?
him down and calling him very bad names and insulting his fatherhood, and she was very ashamed and remorseful about that. She also indicated, you know, using and as
See how shamed and remorseful she is
minor
on the
forms
stand
of
with
violence,
the audience.
shoving, throwing objects. We see that a lot with women when there's not proportional force, women are more likely to throw objects. And then the more severe act of punching him, which a punch falls in the more severe category, and the context as she explained it, was that he was coming after Whitney, and she stood her sister, and she stood in the way and she punched him.
Now, does that make Amber Heard a perpetrator of intimate partner violence?
No, of course not.
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
So that was one of the tasks that I had to consider. That was one of the hypotheses that I had to consider. And given all of the other data, that was not my opinion.
Nah.
Now, you stated that you read a number of therapy records. Please tell the jury.
Remember that name calling was severe violence from Johnny Depp, but not from Amber Heard.
Forensic psychologist.
It's because she was ashamed of it.
To go back in time and see what a person was dealing with, what the content of their distress was, and what the symptoms of their distress was. It really gives us a snapshot in time. So they become very critical as part of the overall forensic psychological evaluation. Because we as psychologists understand how people sort of treat in therapy and what to look for. So in looking back at Ms. Heard's therapy records, we see sort of real-time unfolding of this dynamic in this relationship. We see early on her notes and her report with Bonnie Jacobson and Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes, reports of constant concerns about Mr. Depp's substance abuse, constant concerns about him
reports of
passing out and
violence in the
vomiting,
notes.
constant
Conflating
concerns
here.
about not
Objection,
wanting
Your
to
Honor. Hearsay.
She characterized that as
Overruled.
Thank you. Please continue.
constant concerns about how do I get him into treatment, how do I get him help.
Gee, that sounds a bit controlling, doesn't it?
At this point, early 2012, the beginning of the relationship, because she has to figure out and wants to figure
Where
out
are
a
the
way
notes
to
about the
support
violence?
the man that she's dating
I'm
right
trying to
now, and the man
conflate
that
these
she's
two
fallen
things
in
together.
love with. There were reports in Dr. Jacobs' notes early on about his controlling behavior, about his jealousy behavior, about him not wanting to do certain jobs, of not wanting her to wear certain clothes. So this is going back to 2012. With no indication of why would she be saying that, but for the sole purpose of trying to get help and trying to get guidance in this relationship that she finds so difficult. There are indications, as I mentioned before,
Or because she has
of
a
the sexual
personality
assault
disorder.
and the sexual abuse, and how he would, when he was angry and when he was drunk, it was mostly drug and alcohol fueled rage when he would, throw her on the bed and try to have sex with her. And then, if he was not able to perform, he would get more angry at her and blame her. So we have this dynamic of blaming her for his inability to take responsibility for his behavior. Those themes were throughout Dr. Jacobs' notes.
Did Dr. Jacobs assign any diagnoses to Amber Heard?
She did. Early on, she diagnosed her with panic disorder, and then later with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And did Dr. Jacobs diagnose Amber Heard with borderline personality disorder?
No, she did not.
Histrionic personality disorder?
No, she did not.
And is that important?
That's very important when we're trying to figure out the course of somebody's illness, the course of somebody's psychiatric difficulties. As I stated, or I don't think I got to state, personality disorders usually start in adolescence early.
Objection.
I'll sustain the objection. Next question.
Okay.
She set him up there. I don't think I was allowed to say it.
Yeah, that was dumb.
He didn't even give a proper objection.
Objection. Deposition testimony?
Correct.
And you had, how long of a collateral interview with him?
I believe it was 2 hours.
Okay. And what did you get from all of that data?
So by the time that she gets to Dr. Connell Cohen, which is 2014, I believe, September 2014 is when Dr. Kipper comes on the scene. Ms. Heard's psychological functioning is significantly deteriorated. She's suffering more anxiety, more sleeplessness, more agitation, more emotional dysregulation, this fluctuation in moods. And when you sort of look at the records of what happened in those first 2 years from Dr. Jacobs, and now we have up to Dr. Connell Cohen, and we see all of the incidents that she was exposed to, including the sexual violence and the coercive control, it makes sense to me that her status, her psychological functioning has deteriorated. And in Dr. Connell Cohen's notes, that's what he's always trying to do. He's trying to help her, help Mr. Depp, help her act in a way so that Mr. Depp does not hurt her. Mr. Depp, pardon me, Dr. Connell Cohen was very concerned for Amber Heard's safety, as was Dr. Bonnie Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs was very concerned for her safety, and she continued to talk about safety aspects for Ms. Heard, as was Connell Cohen. They did, both of them, both therapists, understood, and Ms. Heard talked to them about it, that there were times that she fought back and she used violence, and times that she screamed and she said things that she didn't want to. But nevertheless, that did not change the balance for them either, and they were very concerned that because of Mr. Depp's significant substance abuse and his sort of poorly controlled anger, that at some point he was going to seriously hurt her.
Did Dr. Cohen provide Ms. Heard with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder?
Or even death.
No, he did not.
Did he diagnose Amber Heard with histrionic personality disorder?
No, he did not.
Is that important?
It's important that you are have
Skipping over
an
who did
individual
diagnose with.
therapy for over 2 years with one therapist and over 2 years with another therapist,
Oh,
and you're not seeing those characteristics of a personality disorder. If the manifestation of a person's
Ross is going to be
difficulties and illness and symptomology is better
We'll make sure of that.
explained by another disorder, then you don't qualify for the personality disorder. You can't get the diagnosis, and that's part of the criteria. So if it's not a pervasive pattern in a variety of contexts, and it can't be better explained by her trauma experience and the exposure and the symptoms as a result of that trauma, then you don't get a personality disorder. And that's why they didn't diagnose it.
Did you read Dr. Amy Banks' deposition testimony?
Yes, I did.
And what were her findings?
So Dr. Banks had one session, one couple session with Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard. Dr. Banks is very reputable. She works at the Harvard Medical School Cambridge Victim of Violence Program, which is a very well-known program for understanding.
Objection, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
It's non-responsive to the question.
Bolstering.
The question was, what was the finding?
All right.
Tell the jury who Dr. Amy Banks is.
And just like I said, so she's somebody who has a wealth of experience and understanding intimate partner violence and the dynamics of violent relationships. But she only had one session with the couple, and it was her determination when they were both there and the violence was talked about that Mr. Depp did not deny the violence that he perpetrated towards Ms. Heard. She also did, as everybody has, all of our other therapists, because Ms. Heard admitted as such, that she also used low levels of violence as well. So Dr. Amy Banks had that opinion.
Low levels.
Who review Dr. Laurel Anderson's treatment notes and read her deposition?
Punching is how low level again?
Okay, and what was the significance of what you learned from Dr. Anderson?
So Dr. Anderson similarly thought that there was violence and abuse in this relationship. She was the one therapist out of the four who qualified it as mutual abuse, which the determination I've talked to you about, I don't necessarily agree with. But she did see and did understand that there was violence and abuse by Mr. Depp. What was most notable was that after the December 15th, 2015 episode, Ms. Heard called her in addition to calling Connell Cohen and reached out to a number of people. But she saw Dr. Anderson in her office. And Dr. Anderson saw 2 bruises on her face and told me, my husband kicked me and he pushed me and he punched me in the head. And should I call the police?
Objection, Your
What
Honor.
should I do?
Hello, PSA.
She's not reading.
Not PSA.
Sustained objection. Next question.
Hearsay has nothing to do with whether or not she's reading or dummy.
What conclusions did you make as a result of what you reviewed for Dr. Laurel Anderson?
My take of reading Dr. Laurel Anderson's deposition and seeing her, redacted notes was that, from my professional opinion, this was a very serious incident and a very serious allegation of intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. If a patient comes into my office with 2 bruises and alleges being pushed, shoved, and kicked by her partner, I'm going to be very concerned, and I'm going to mobilize a lot more resources to help that individual. And for some reason, that did not happen for Ms. Heard.
Some reading
Believe
psychologists
her.
didn't do it.
Clinical impressions from reading these notes from Amber Heard's treatment providers and the couple's therapists.
Objection, compound.
Sustained.
What are your overall clinical
Ding,
impressions
ding.
from reading what you told everybody you read?
Objection, compound.
I don't know how to get it less compound. Your Honor.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Thank you.
That one wasn't
So
common.
my overall
Second.
impression of the treatment notes was, there's significant support for the fact that there was intimate partner violence in this relationship. It was consistently reported over time, and there were couples therapists who saw and understood that. There were. Mr. Depp also attended a session with Dr. Connell Cohen with Ms. Heard. And in that session, he was very belligerent and mean and yelling and intimidating. And he even got up and stormed out, rolled a joint. This is somebody who's poorly controlled. That's the same thing that Dr. Laurel Anderson said about him. And he stormed out of one of those sessions too. So there were a total of 6 sessions, a couple sessions, but Mr. Depp stormed out of 2 of them. So there's only 4 couple sessions for these 2 individuals in this just highly volatile, highly damaging relationship that was, punctuated by the coercive control and the intimate partner violence.
What if any observations did you make about Amber Heard's psychological status over that period?
I mean, the record was very clear that her psychological status deteriorated as she was in a relationship with Mr. Depp. She kept getting worse. She was losing weight. By the end, she was down to, I think, 105 pounds from about 125, 130. She was taking significantly more medication than she's ever taken in her life. She was having more panic, more anxiety, more distress. More affect dysregulation, just really an inability to regulate her mood, more anger outbursts. So it can significantly deteriorate over time.
You talked about weight. What, if any, diagnoses did Bonnie Jacobs make about Amber Heard having an eating disorder?
That is the most leading question.
That Ms. Heard had an eating disorder.
What, if any,
Gorham's notes should have been in your record.
Reported by Amber Heard, right?
Indication in his record that she had an eating disorder.
Now, what, if any, observations did you make about the impact of Mr. Depp's substance abuse?
So the substance abuse was a very relevant and complicating factor to this relationship. When you pair that level of substance abuse with the level of intimate partner violence and coercive control, it's a very, very disastrous mix. And one of the things that happens with the substance abuse is a very similar dynamic that happens with the intimate partner violence. That there's the lying, there's the hiding, there's the cheating, there's the obfuscation, the rationalization about the drinking, the rationalization about the violence, the trying to, promises, I'm going to do better, I'm going to get clean and sober, I'm not going to hit you anymore.
Literally did get clean.
Yep.
Sober.
Cook and wine.
He went to detox. He hired a private doctor who specialized in sobriety and detoxification. It's not like he was just manipulating and controlling. He actually did that. The person who didn't was her. And when you asked her if she would, which I'm sure would be intimate partner violence in this lady's opinion, when you asked her if she would do that, she said, no, I love the cocaine. I want to keep doing it. Oh, this is frustrating.
I mean, they literally just saw a note that Amber Heard is doing MDMA and mushrooms in Johnny Depp's apartment with some strange man without his knowledge, and yet he's paranoid and has a drug problem. It's mind-boggling.
It's insane. The level of dismissiveness. Well, he called her names, which is extremely controlling and terrifying. She engaged in low levels of psychological violence, like name calling. Wait, what? How do you reconcile holding those 2 positions at the same time? Her violence is all reactive. It's like, well, is there any evidence that any of her violence was actually reactive to anything at all?
Where's the evidence of his violence that caused her to react? Where is it?
Because if it's name calling that she's reactive violencing to, then her name calling would be him reactive violencing to. Again, these positions are so wildly biased that it's insane. And I hope the jury.
I'm sorry, but if she's reacting to name calling with physical violence, that's an assault. That is
I agree.
self-defense.
Well, did you consider though that she really wants to win this case?
If you look at the genders of the people she was at, you can tell that you get the other result. And there's no way to interpret these facts the same way if you flip the genders on what's going on.
Oh, yeah.
What, if any, dynamics and coping styles are connected to the substance abuse by Mr. Depp?
So they share similarities. There's a lot of lying when somebody's a substance abuser. There's a lot of hiding. There's a lot of concealment. There's a lot of rationalization. There's a lot of blame, blaming your partner for your inability to stay clean and sober. There's a lot of the promises to change and the promises to get better. So a lot of these dynamics sort of co-occur, in a situation of substance abuse and domestic violence. They're very similar. The difficulty in this relationship is that the majority of the violent episodes and the sexually violent episodes were in these alcohol and drug-fueled rages. That was predominantly when those happened. When he wasn't in those stages, we still saw the obsessive jealousy and the coercive control and the possessiveness. That still persisted. But when the alcohol and the drugs came together is when Amber Heard was more in danger of being hurt by him.
Why didn't Amber Heard leave the relationship sooner?
Yeah,
No,
I
it's just speculation, Your Honor.
Yep.
Have you formed, based on your experience and based on your 29 hours of clinical evaluation of Amber Heard, what is your understanding of why Amber Heard didn't leave the relationship?
Objection beyond the scope of the disclosure.
It clearly is not. I mean, it's
Hello.
clearly undisclosed.
That's just an indication of something they argued about at sidebar. Going through.
Did you hear what she just said? Point to where you say it's not. Well, just point to the disclosure.
Right.
It's not there.
But this is what they're arguing about that we didn't hear, is what they actually disclosed was going to be her testimony as an expert, which you have to give the other side kind of something to work with as this is what she could testify to. And in your depo, you always start with, are all of your opinions contained in your report? Okay, so now you can't say anything that's outside of your report, and it's for this reason they're trying to cage him in.
Yeah, it's
That asking her son.
Point where it's not, please.
This doesn't work. She's looking for it in the disclosure right now. But again, yeah. This is frustrating because anything about Amber Heard's reasoning as to why she didn't leave should come in through Amber Heard. Any testimony, like Amber Heard is there available as a witness. So if you're going to testify as to why she didn't leave, it's got to be from the person who decided not to leave.
Yep.
Not from a psychologist's determination.
Nope.
Unless
He's
it's
right.
like you said, she testified, it's in evidence, go for it.
And I mean, there's room for like testifying about
You
leave. So
indicated that your main opinion was that Amber Heard's report of violence and abuse in her relationship with Mr. Depp is consistent with what is known as intimate partner violence, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And why did you believe that Amber Heard, why did you have, what formed your basis of that opinion? In a nutshell.
Asked and answered, Your Honor.
The
Objection
basis of
cumulative.
the opinion was looking at all the dynamics in this relationship, looking at not just the hitting and the yelling, but looking at how much more hitting was done, looking at the coercive control, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the sexual violence, the choking behavior, the threats to kill. Those are all, as I state, very significant and often found in cases of lethal domestic violence. Those were significant severity factors. And looking at all those, that's what tipped the scales. That even though she yelled and said some horrible things and hit him, never was able to shift the balance of power and control in that relationship.
Now, you have discussed with Amber Heard and you have reviewed and evaluated the emotional impact on Amber Heard.
Elon Musk wore this outfit yesterday at the Met Gala, and I'm not
as a
kidding.
result of the three counterclaim statements, correct? The three alleged defamatory statements made by Mr. Depp through Mr. Waldman, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Objection, compound leading.
Just, thank you. Could you please tell the jury what psychological impact these statements had on Amber Heard?
Yes, so there were 3 statements that I evaluated. May I check my notes to give you the dates and my recollection so that I can be clear?
Since I couldn't put it in, that's might be the fastest way, Your Honor.
I'd rather not address the court.
Since I couldn't put it in?
Okay.
Yes.
So there were 3 statements on April 8th, 2020, April 27th, 2020, and June 24th, 2020 that I queried her about and asked her about. The one that, what happens is if somebody who, like Ms. Heard, has trauma-based symptoms and PTSD, we say that PTSD is a cue-based disorder. There are things that happen in the environment that trigger it and make it worse. And having to refute that your report of violence and abuse is a hoax makes that trauma activated. So it makes the PTSD symptoms at that time become more intense and more severe. So she would have more intrusive thoughts, more nightmares, more sleeplessness, more difficulty engaging with other people, depression, sadness, stress. All of that would happen when one of these statements came out. The one that was, the most difficult was the one where they said that her sexual violence
Objection, Your
was a
Honor.
hoax.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
Yep. I definitely hear that.
The one that was most difficult for Ms. Heard was the statement about calling her sexual violence a hoax. As I stated earlier, most women try very diligently to put their sexual violence in a box, bury it down, not want to talk about it, not want to, have anything related to it come up. And, she's done, by my estimation, in her coping, although she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, she also has a high degree of coping strategies. But when this would happen, it sort of would just, everything would deteriorate. And this is the one thing that women are always afraid of, that no one's going to believe them. No one's going to take them seriously. And when somebody comes out in the popular media and calls your experience a hoax, that lended itself to more severe psychological and traumatic symptomatology for her.
Dr. Hughes, are all of your opinions that you have provided today within a reasonable degree of psychological probability or certainty?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Opinions request?
I think this is a good time to go ahead and break for the
Probability
day.
or certainty, usually it's just one or the other.
Of this witness of Dr. Hughes. So if you can have a good
Women
evening,
can't
not
lie,
discussing
you know.
anybody, and,
Women can lie well.
don't do any outside research, okay? We'll see you in the morning. Thank you.
Getting spicy.
you gotta give it to the defense there. That's a banger of a first witness. I mean, there's all sorts of problems, but she did. I mean, she just got into evidence. Well, not into evidence specifically, but
She
got into
explained the whole
mind.
case.
Yeah,
She got into the jury's mind.
yeah.
Okay. All right, Dr. Hughes, since you're still in the middle of your testimony, please don't discuss your testimony with anybody, including the attorneys, okay? And anything that you looked at, referenced during your direct examination, if you could just turn that over so they can review that before cross-examination, okay? All right, thank you,
Your
ma'am.
Honor, may I just, I presume she wants to be able to take that back with her.
We can
and
get
review it.
copies of it. We'll get whatever it is.
Okay, great.
We'll make sure you get copies of it. So you get copies of it so she can keep her originals.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Okay, well, no, we're not talking right now. Court session. Thank you. All right. So anything else then? So we'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m., correct? All right. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Woo.
Here we go.
Was the jury there for that? I think they were. And she said they have everything, and Depp's lawyer said, no, we don't. In front of the jury.
Yeah.
Was the jury still in there, or had they left?
Chu was looking that way after, so I think they were still there.
Wild. Just hit Elaine while you
Yep,
walk
I
by.
said over.
Oh, dang it, missed opportunity. Just close.
I said over.
Yeah, that would not play well.
Who's the Stanley Tucci looking dude?
Somebody said that there's a priest in the gallery earlier.
Oh, he's her new PR. He's her new PR guy.
Yeah, that's why he was sitting next to the Court TV chick. That makes sense.
Yep, because
And I'm sure he's going to be having a field day tonight. Because all of this, they're going to be trying to get news organizations to report as gospel truth. And, you know, they're just going to make a run on his... and there's basically nothing you can do about it because of the whole... So, I mean, they can just say this is what was reported, not we're saying it's accurate.
Well, we knew she was going to have good days as soon as it was her chance to put on her case. I mean, that's just part of the process.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And like I said, in my opinion, you know, there's a bunch of problems with her testimony. I'm really interested to see on cross, but I think she's a good witness. She has the credentials. I think she borders on coming across overly biased, but that's how I perceive her. I can't determine that the jury will see her the same way. I don't know how you can't. She comes across exceedingly biased. But I think the real takedown of her will be on rebuttal. Because, I mean, they can cross her and go to some of her issues, but I think it's bringing back the other doctor to bolster her own conclusions and talk about how this lady's a nut job.
Yeah.
Like, did you interview Johnny Depp at all? Did you ask him if he had committed intimate partner violence?
Yeah, but what if she says I wanted to and he refused?
That could be.
yeah,
You got to file motions, right, Andrea? I think you said that on another video that they wanted to put him through the ringer like Amber was, and they objected, and the court said they didn't have to.
Yeah, that's right. They tried to get an IME of Johnny Depp, and no good cause was found.
So that could be walking into some fire there if you ask that.
Okay, that could be.
Maybe just did you read his depo? Because what do you think about how he explains the situation? Because she said she reviewed his UK transcripts and things like that. So if that's true, how does that affect your analysis, basically?
I'm gonna go on here.
He said he didn't actually kick her in the back. Maybe it was a light tap on the back, didn't you? Would you agree that a light tap, light playful tap, is not a kick?
Well, they have a massive amount of information to work with, not the least of which is, you know, they asked for